I find myself thinking about fermentation, about transformation, about how the smallest organisms we cannot see have shaped the largest currents of human history, and how a simple act, fruit falling from a tree, grain moistened by rain, honey diluted by morning dew, could unlock something that would travel with us through millennia, something that would become ceremony and commerce, medicine and myth, celebration and sorrow. There is something almost magical in the idea that sweetness, given time, given warmth, given the invisible work of yeast drifting through the air, becomes something else entirely, something that changes not just in flavor but in effect, in meaning, in the way it moves through a body, through a culture, through an empire. I imagine the first person who tasted it, perhaps by accident, perhaps after a clay jar had been left in a corner too long, or a wooden bowl of crushed grapes had sat in the sun for days. And there was that first sip, that unexpected sharpness on the tongue, that warmth spreading through the chest, that subtle shift in perception, in mood, in the weight of the world. They would not have known the chemistry, would not have understood that single-celled fungi were consuming sugars and exhaling ethanol and carbon dioxide, would not have known about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or enzymatic processes, or the relationship between temperature and fermentation rate. But they would have known the result, would have felt it, would have recognized that something sacred had occurred. And so it began, this relationship between humans and fermented beverages, stretching back so far that we find its traces in pottery shards from the Neolithic, in residues clinging to the inner surfaces of jars that were already ancient when the first cities rose, in the careful records kept by scribes who documented rations and tributes, in the myths that placed wine in the hands of gods and beer at the foundation of creation itself. I think about how alcohol is both singular and plural, one phenomenon with countless expressions, beer and wine and mead and sake and pulque and kvass and arak and countless others, each one emerging from what was available, what grew in that particular soil, what the climate allowed, what tradition preserved, and yet all of them sharing that essential transformation, that patient waiting for invisible forces to do their work. There is something deeply human about this, about learning to guide a natural process, to create conditions where wild yeasts would settle and begin their mysterious labor, to protect the fermenting liquid from spoilage, to develop techniques that could be passed down through generations, refined, perfected, until what began as happy accident became deliberate craft. I find myself drawn to the stories, to the way alcohol appears again and again in the archaeological record, in the written histories, in the religious texts and legal codes and medical treatises, as if we cannot tell the story of human civilization without also telling the story of these transformed liquids, without acknowledging how deeply they are woven into the fabric of our social structures, our economies, our rituals of birth and death, and everything between. And perhaps that is because alcohol has always existed at intersections between nourishment and intoxication, between the everyday and the sacred, between individual experience and collective ritual, between pleasure and danger, between the wild processes of nature and the controlled practices of culture. I imagine the slow accumulation of knowledge, how each generation learned something new about the timing, the temperatures, the vessels, the ingredients, how they discovered that certain grains made better beer, that certain grapes yielded finer wine, that honey diluted just so would ferment into something golden and potent, that the white film forming on the surface was not always contamination, but sometimes a protective layer, that wooden barrels imparted their own subtle flavors, that aging could mellow harshness into complexity. This knowledge was precious, was power, was wealth, and so we find it guarded by priesthoods and guilds, regulated by laws and taxed by governments, used as currency and tribute, poured out as offerings to deities who were thought to have given the gift of fermentation to humanity, or perhaps to have created the world itself from fermented grain, as in the ancient Sumerian myths where the goddess Ninkasi presides over the brewing of beer. The evidence reaches back further than we might imagine, back to a time when humans were just beginning to settle, to plant seeds intentionally rather than simply gathering what grew wild, to store surplus grain in vessels made from clay, and in those vessels, in those stores of barley and wheat and millet, the conditions were perfect for something unexpected to occur. In the Fertile Crescent, in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, archaeologists have found residues in pottery fragments dating back 9,000 years, chemical signatures that speak of fermented beverages made from grain, from dates, from honey, evidence that the people of these ancient settlements were already familiar with the transformation, already incorporating it into their daily lives and their ceremonial practices. There is a question that scholars still debate, whether agriculture emerged because humans wanted to ensure a steady supply of grain for bread, or whether the desire for beer, for that reliable source of fermented drink, might have been equally important in motivating people to stay in one place, to tend crops, to build permanent settlements around their fields and granaries. It is a curious thought that civilization itself might owe something to fermentation, that the need to protect brewing supplies, to maintain the knowledge of how to brew, to gather for communal drinking, might have been among the threads that wove scattered groups into villages, villages into cities, cities into kingdoms. The Sumerians left us recipes, actual instructions pressed into clay tablets in cuneiform script, and among these practical texts we find hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, and the hymn is itself a brewing manual describing how to soak grain until it sprouts, how to dry the malt and crush it, how to mix it with bread and dates in large vats, how to filter the mash through woven straws to draw out the liquid, how to let it ferment in vessels cooled by the earth. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia was not what we might picture today. It was thick and nutritious, consumed through long straws to avoid the sediment and grain husks floating on the surface. It was a daily ration for workers, a payment for labor, a temple offering, a social lubricant at festivals, and it came in multiple varieties, some stronger than others, some flavored with different combinations of dates and spices and herbs. The brewing was often done by women, and in many ancient societies this pattern holds. Fermentation as women's knowledge, women's craft, passed from mother to daughter alongside other essential skills, the timing and the temperatures and the signs that indicated success or spoilage. Meanwhile, in the Nile Valley, the Egyptians were developing their own rich tradition of brewing, and of winemaking as well, for grapes grew abundantly in the delta and along the river's banks. And tomb paintings show us the process in vivid detail, workers treading grapes in large vats, the juice flowing into vessels, the sealed jars being stored in cool cellars or marked with the year and the vineyard and the name of the vintner. Wine in Egypt was a luxury, associated with the elite, with royal banquets and religious ceremonies, while beer remained the drink of the common people, nutritious and safer than water, which could carry disease from the river. And here we see a pattern that will repeat across cultures. Alcohol serving not just as intoxicant, but as nutrition, as hydration, as medicine. The Egyptian medical papyri mention beer and wine as vehicles for other medicines, as bases for healing compounds, and sometimes as cures in themselves, prescribed for various ailments in specific quantities and preparations, mixed with honey or herbs or ground minerals, applied externally or consumed. The dead were buried with supplies for the afterlife, and among the food and furniture and precious objects, there were always jars of beer, containers of wine, because the journey beyond required sustenance, and the pleasures of life should continue in the realm of Osiris. In China, a different path emerged. Rice became the foundation of fermented drinks, and the process was different from the brewing of barley beer, requiring the use of specific molds to break down the starches in rice into fermentable sugars, a parallel discovery of how to manipulate microorganisms, how to create the conditions for transformation. The earliest evidence of rice-based alcohol in China dates back some 9,000 years as well, to Neolithic villages in the Yellow River Valley. Chemical analysis of pottery revealing traces of a mixed fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit, suggesting that even in these early times, people were experimenting, combining ingredients, discovering what worked, what pleased the palate, what produced the desired effects. By the time of the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years ago, alcohol had become deeply embedded in Chinese culture, used in elaborate ritual ceremonies to honor ancestors, poured out as offerings in bronze vessels of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship, vessels that themselves became symbols of power and legitimacy, passed down through generations, buried with nobles and kings. The oracle bones, those fragments of turtle shell and ox bone used for divination, contain characters that relate to alcohol, to brewing, to ritual drinking, evidence of how central these practices were to religious and political life, how the intoxicated state was seen as a bridge between the human and spirit worlds, a way of communing with forces beyond ordinary perception. In the Indus Valley, in the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, we find less written evidence because the script remains undeciphered, but the archaeological remains suggest sophisticated brewing operations, and we know that by the Vedic period, several thousand years ago, the ancient Indians were producing soma, a ritual drink mentioned repeatedly in the Rig Veda, its exact composition now lost to time, debated by scholars, but clearly central to religious practice, consumed by priests, offered to gods, associated with inspiration and divine vision. The Greeks inherited their wine culture from earlier civilizations, from the Minoans on Crete, who were making wine before the Greek language was even written down, from the Phoenician traders who spread viticulture across the Mediterranean, and the Greeks elevated wine to an art form a subject of philosophy and poetry. They mixed their wine with water, considering it barbaric to drink it undiluted, and they had special vessels for the mixing, the crater, and for the serving, the kylix and the amphora. And wine was central to the symposium, that uniquely Greek institution where men gathered to drink and talk and sing and debate into the night, where philosophy was born in wine-soaked conversation, where politics was discussed and alliances formed and culture transmitted. Dionysus, the god of wine, was a complex figure associated not just with pleasure and celebration, but with ecstasy and madness, with the dissolution of normal boundaries, with transformation itself. His festivals involved theatrical performances that would evolve into Greek drama, processions and rituals that allowed for temporary inversions of social order, moments when the usual rules could be suspended. The Greeks established vineyards throughout their colonies, spreading wine culture from the Black Sea to southern Italy and Sicily, to the southern coasts of France and Spain. And as they traded, as they shared their techniques and their appreciation, wine became a marker of civilization itself, a distinction between the cultured Mediterranean peoples and the beer-drinking tribes to the north. The Romans adopted Greek wine culture and expanded it, industrialized it, creating vast vineyard estates worked by slave labor, developing new techniques for viticulture and winemaking, for storing and aging, for transporting wine across their growing empire in amphorae sealed with pitch, marked with stamps indicating origin and date and quality. Roman law regulated the wine trade carefully, protecting certain regional varieties, taxing imports and exports, and wine flowed along Roman roads and shipping routes, from the sunny hillsides of Italy and Greece and Spain to the far reaches of the empire, to Britain and Germania and North Africa, to the legions stationed on distant frontiers, to the cities that sprang up in the wake of conquest. The Romans also appreciated beer, especially in the northern provinces where grapes would not easily grow, and they encountered local brewing traditions among the Celtic and Germanic peoples, traditions that predated Roman arrival by thousands of years, for these northern cultures had their own deep relationship with fermented grain, with mead made from honey, with drinks flavored with herbs, and plants that grew in their forests. Across the ocean, in the Americas, other traditions were emerging independently. The peoples of Mesoamerica fermenting the sap of the maguey plant into pulque, a milky white beverage with its own gods and rituals, its own social regulations about who could drink it and when and how much. In South America, the making of chicha from maize, chewed and spat to begin the fermentation process, the enzymes in saliva, breaking down the starches, a communal activity, women gathering to prepare the grain, to begin the transformation that would yield the drink for festivals, for offerings, for the binding of communities through shared consumption. These traditions existed in parallel, separated by vast distances and millennia of independent development, yet converging on the same fundamental discovery that sugars could be transformed, that grains and fruits and plant saps could become something more than simple nourishment, could become vessels for altered consciousness, for social bonding, for sacred communion. The medieval period in Europe saw monasteries become the guardians of brewing and winemaking knowledge, monks and nuns perfecting techniques behind stone walls. In quiet cloisters where patience and precision were virtues, where the slow work of fermentation aligned with the rhythms of prayer and contemplation. The Benedictines and Cistercians especially became renowned for their beers and wines, each monastery developing its own recipes, its own character of brew. The monks carefully tending their vineyards on sunny slopes, their hop gardens in the valleys, their barley fields in the lowlands, understanding that the quality of the final product depended on countless small decisions made throughout the year. They kept detailed records, noting which grapes produced the finest wine, which combination of grains made the most balanced beer, how long the fermentation should proceed, how to recognize when the process was complete, when to rack the liquid off the sediment, how to clarify and stabilize what they had made. Beer was essential to monastic life, drunk at meals because water was often unsafe, brewed strong for the monks themselves and weaker for visitors and the poor who came to the monastery gates, and certain monasteries became famous for their brewing, their reputation spreading along pilgrimage routes, their techniques slowly diffusing outward into the secular world. The Trappist breweries that still operate today are the direct descendants of this tradition, maintaining methods that reach back centuries, using the profits from their brewing to support their contemplative communities, to fund charitable works, connecting the sacred and the commercial in ways that would have been familiar to their medieval predecessors. Wine production, too, was largely centered in monasteries and in the estates of nobles, the great vineyards of Burgundy and Bordeaux, of the Rhine and Moselle valleys, of Tuscany and Rioja, already establishing reputations that persist into our own time, already learning which grape varieties thrived in which soils and microclimates, which slopes caught the sun at the right angle, which riverside plots benefited from the reflected light and moderated temperatures. The process of making wine was becoming more refined, more deliberate. Vintners learning to control fermentation more precisely, discovering that different yeasts imparted different flavors, that temperature mattered, that the timing of harvest affected sugar content and acidity, that the vessels used for fermentation and aging, whether clay or wood or later glass, contributed their own subtle influences. In the cooler climates where grapes struggled, where beer was the dominant drink, brewing became a household task, women's work in most places, ale wives who brewed in their homes and sold the excess at market, marked by the ale stake, a pole thrust through a bush or wreath to signal that fresh beer was available. The ale was drunk young, within days of brewing, because without hops it spoiled quickly, and the flavor would have been quite different from modern beer, sweeter perhaps, muddier, with the taste of the grains prominent, sometimes flavored with groot, a mixture of herbs and spices that varied by region and by brewer, yarrow and wild rosemary and sweet gale and mugwort and dozens of other plants, each adding their own bitterness and aromatics and preservative qualities. The introduction of hops changed everything, slowly at first, spreading from Central Europe westward over several centuries. Hops added bitterness to balance the sweetness of the malt, but more importantly, they acted as a preservative, allowing beer to last weeks or even months without souring, making it possible to brew larger batches, to transport beer over longer distances, to develop commercial brewing operations that could serve entire towns and cities. By the late medieval period, by the time of the Renaissance, brewing was becoming industrialized, moving from the household to the commercial brewery, from small batches to large production, from the domain of women to the province of guild-controlled craftsmen, and with this shift came regulation, quality standards, taxation. The German purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, enacted in Bavaria in the early 16th century, mandated that beer could contain only water and barley and hops, later amended to include yeast once its role was understood. This was partly about quality control, partly about protecting the wheat supply for bread, partly about eliminating competing brewers who used other additives, and it became a point of pride, a standard that some brewers still observe more than 500 years later. Distillation enters the story here, the technology arriving in Europe from the Islamic world, where alchemists had developed sophisticated apparatus for separating and purifying substances, for concentrating essences, and this technology, applied to fermented beverages, produced something entirely new: spirits, liquor, concentrated alcohol that burned going down, that could be preserved almost indefinitely, that could be flavored and aged in ways that created entirely new categories of drink. The earliest distilled beverages in Europe were probably made by monks, used as medicines, aqua vitae, the water of life, prescribed for various ailments, rubbed on sore joints, taken internally for digestion, for strengthening the heart, for warding off plague, and only gradually, over centuries, did distilled spirits become beverages consumed for pleasure rather than strictly for health. Whiskey emerged in Ireland and Scotland, distilled from barley beer, rough and fiery at first, gradually refined, the Scots discovering that aging it in wooden casks mellowed the harsh edges, allowed flavors to develop and integrate, the wood itself contributing vanillas and tannins, the slow oxidation creating complexity. In France, the distillation of wine produced brandy, and in the region of Cognac, on the Charente River, a particular style emerged: double distillation in copper pot stills, aging in oak barrels from the Limousin forest, creating a spirit of remarkable smoothness and depth, a luxury product that would be shipped around the world in the age of exploration. The Caribbean became the birthplace of rum, a spirit made from molasses, the byproduct of sugar production. Enslaved Africans working the plantations discovered, or were forced to discover, that this dark, sticky residue could be fermented and distilled, producing a powerful spirit that became currency in the triangular trade, shipped to New England, where it was distilled again, traded for enslaved people in Africa. The whole horrific system lubricated by alcohol at multiple points. Gin arose in the Netherlands, flavored with juniper and other botanicals, a clear spirit that became wildly popular in England in the 18th century, so popular that it became a social crisis. The gin craze, with cheaply made spirits flooding the markets of London, affordable even to the desperately poor, producing epidemic levels of public drunkenness, violence, and all the social ills that accompany widespread alcohol abuse. The government responded with regulation, with taxation designed to make gin more expensive, with licensing requirements for sellers, slowly bringing the market under control, channeling production toward higher quality, toward the London dry gin that would become the standard, crisp and botanical, mixed into cocktails or drunk with tonic water in the colonies where quinine was needed against malaria. Russia and Poland developed vodka, distilled to high proof and then filtered. traditionally made from grain but sometimes from potatoes, drunk neat and ice cold, an integral part of social rituals, of hospitality, of toasts that bound people together in mutual obligation and celebration. In Mexico, the distillation of agave produced mezcal and its more refined cousin tequila, spirits that captured something of the desert landscape, smoky or bright, earthy or crisp, varying by region and by the variety of agave and by the methods of production, roasting the hearts of the plants in underground pits or in ovens, fermenting the juice, distilling sometimes multiple times. Meanwhile, wine continued its evolution. European colonizers planting vines wherever they settled and the climate allowed, in South Africa and Australia, in California and Chile and Argentina, sometimes successfully, sometimes struggling for generations before the right varieties and techniques were discovered. Before the new terroirs revealed their character, the wines of the New World began as imitations of European styles, but gradually developed their own identities, bolder flavors from hotter climates, different balance of fruit and acid and tannin, different philosophies of wine-making, less constrained by centuries of tradition, more willing to experiment with technology and technique. The phylloxera epidemic of the late 19th century nearly destroyed European viticulture. A tiny aphid accidentally imported from America, attacking the roots of European grapevines, spreading vineyard by vineyard, region by region, devastating the wine industry, forcing replanting on American rootstock that was resistant to the pest, a crisis that reshaped the wine world, that destroyed some varieties forever while creating opportunities for others to rise. Beer underwent its own transformation in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution bringing new technologies, the thermometer and the hydrometer allowing brewers to measure and control their process with precision never before possible. Understanding for the first time the relationship between temperature and sugar content and alcohol production, the isolation and cultivation of pure yeast strains, pioneered by Emil Christian Hansen at the Carlsberg Brewery in Copenhagen, allowed brewers to ensure consistency batch after batch, to eliminate wild yeasts and bacteria that could spoil the beer, to create lagers that were clean and crisp, that could be stored for long periods, that shipped well and scaled to industrial production. Lager became the dominant beer style globally, refreshing and approachable, less challenging than the complex ales that preceded it, perfect for mass production and mass consumption, for the working classes in the rapidly growing industrial cities, for the beer gardens of Bavaria and the saloons of America, and the pubs of every nation touched by industrialization. Prohibition arrived like a thunderclap in many places, most famously in the United States, where the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages in 1920, the culmination of decades of temperance activism, of moral campaigns against the perceived evils of drink, of genuine concern about the social costs of alcohol abuse, the domestic violence and poverty and health problems that often accompanied heavy drinking. The movement was driven largely by women, by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, by activists who had witnessed firsthand the devastation that alcoholism could bring to families, who saw the saloon as a threat to home and hearth, who believed that banning alcohol would usher in an era of moral improvement, of productivity, of social harmony, But Prohibition did not eliminate drinking. It drove it underground, into speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors, into private homes where bathtub gin was mixed in secret, into the realm of organized crime that grew wealthy and powerful, smuggling liquor across borders from Canada and Mexico, from ships hovering just outside territorial waters, bootleggers racing through the night with their illegal cargo. The quality of available alcohol declined precipitously. Industrial alcohol was redistilled and sold for drinking despite the poisons added to denature it. People went blind from methanol poisoning, died from contaminated spirits. Homemade concoctions were unpredictable in strength and safety, and yet people continued to drink, perhaps even more than before, the forbidden nature of alcohol adding to its allure. Prohibition ended in 1933, repealed by the 21st Amendment, a rare instance of a constitutional amendment being reversed. The experiment judged a failure. The social costs of enforcement and illegal trade deemed worse than the regulated sale of alcohol. But the legacy persisted in the consolidation of the brewing and distilling industries, in the three-tier system of a distribution that separated producers from retailers, in lasting cultural attitudes about alcohol and morality. Other countries had their own experiences with prohibition. Nordic countries implementing various restrictions. Russia attempting to limit vodka consumption during the First World War. Some regions of Canada and Australia banning alcohol at different times, each experiment revealing the difficulty of suppressing through law what is embedded in culture, what serves so many functions beyond simple intoxication. The mid-20th century saw alcohol production become increasingly industrialized and consolidated, small breweries and distilleries absorbed by larger corporations, brands becoming national and then international, standardization replacing regional variation, efficiency and consistency prized over craft and character. Beer became lighter, blander, less distinctive, brewed to offend no one and appeal to the broadest possible market, advertised heavily on the new medium of television, associated with sports and masculinity and leisure, the working man's reward after a hard day, the fuel for weekend recreation and socializing, wine production modernized as well, new technologies allowing precise control over fermentation temperature, stainless steel tanks replacing old wooden vats, scientific understanding of malolactic fermentation and phenolic compounds and the chemistry of aging, some winemakers embracing these tools to make cleaner, more consistent wines, others resisting in favor of traditional methods, arguing that something essential was lost in the pursuit of technical perfection. The French concept of terroir gained prominence. The idea that wine is not just a product of the grape variety and the winemaker's skill, but of the specific place where the vines grow, the soil composition and drainage, the angle of the slope and direction it faces, the microclimate of that particular vineyard, all of this combining to create something that cannot be exactly replicated elsewhere. This notion stood in contrast to the New World approach, at least initially, which tended to emphasize the winemaker's control, the ability to manipulate and perfect, to create wines that expressed a vision rather than simply revealing a place. But gradually, even New World producers began to speak of terroir, to seek out distinctive sites, to allow place to speak through their wines. The late 20th century brought a craft revolution. starting in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s. Small breweries reopening, making beer with flavor and character, reviving old styles and inventing new ones, experimenting with hops and malts and yeasts, challenging the dominance of the industrial lagers. This movement began in Britain and in America, spread to Belgium and Germany and Scandinavia, and eventually around the world. Beer enthusiasts seeking out rare and unusual brews, willing to pay premium prices for quality and distinctiveness, creating a market that allowed small producers to thrive, that valued craftsmanship over scale, tradition and innovation over efficiency and consistency. Craft distilling followed a similar path. Small batch whiskey and gin and vodka, producers emphasizing local ingredients and traditional methods, aged spirits in small barrels that accelerated the interaction between wood and liquid, distillers becoming celebrities in some cases, their products allocated and sought after, commanding prices that would have seemed absurd just a generation earlier. Wine experienced its own quality revolution, particularly in regions that had been overlooked or undervalued. Napa Valley establishing itself as world-class, Oregon and Washington developing their own identities, New Zealand, Sauvignon Blanc, and Australian Shiraz finding international markets, wines from Chile and Argentina and South Africa competing successfully with European bottles many times their price. The Judgment of Paris in 1976, a blind tasting where California wines bested prestigious French bottles, shattered assumptions about Old World supremacy, opened the market to new possibilities, suggested that great wine could come from anywhere with the right combination of climate and soil and skill and vision. Science continued advancing understanding, researchers identifying the specific compounds responsible for different flavors and aromas, mapping the genome of wine grapes and brewing yeasts, developing new varieties resistant to disease or adapted to changing climates, creating tools that allowed producers to work with unprecedented precision. Yet alongside this scientific progress came a counter-movement toward natural wine, minimal intervention, organic or biodynamic farming, wild yeast fermentation, no added sulfites or other preservatives, wines that were sometimes flawed but always distinctive, that carried the mark of their making, that rejected the polished perfection of modern enology in favor of something more raw, more alive, more connected to the rhythms of nature. The globalization of alcohol culture accelerated, Japanese whiskey gaining recognition and then commanding extraordinary prices, craft's sake finding audiences beyond Japan, mezcal moving from regional Mexican specialty to international phenomenon, wine being produced in China and India and Thailand, beer styles crossing borders and hybridizing, IPAs brewed in England and lagers in Belgium and stouts in Singapore. Health consciousness grew as well, research into the effects of alcohol on the body, yielding complex and sometimes contradictory findings, moderate consumption of red wine, possibly protective for cardiovascular health due to resveratrol and other compounds, but any amount of alcohol also linked to increased cancer risk, to liver damage, to cognitive impairment, to accidents and injuries and social harms. The relationship between societies and alcohol began shifting in many places, drunk driving laws becoming stricter, social acceptance of heavy drinking declining, awareness of alcoholism as a disease rather than a moral failing spreading, treatment programs developing, mutual support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous helping millions, yet consumption continuing, even increasing in some regions while declining in others. Younger generations in some countries drinking less than their parents, seeking out quality over quantity, or abstaining entirely, while in other nations, particularly in Asia and Africa, consumption rising with economic development and urbanization, patterns playing out that had been seen before in Europe and America, alcohol becoming more available and more affordable as societies industrialized and traditional structures weakened, the science of addiction advanced, neurobiology revealing how alcohol affects the brain's reward systems, how repeated exposure changes neural pathways, how some individuals are more vulnerable than others due to genetics, to early experiences, to co-occurring mental health conditions, understanding growing but the problem persisting, millions struggling with dependence, families disrupted, lives lost to the consequences of a substance that is simultaneously ancient and ordinary, dangerous and deeply woven into the fabric of human culture. Marketing became more sophisticated, brands creating identities and lifestyles, associating their products with aspiration and belonging, craft producers telling stories of heritage and authenticity, large corporations buying up smaller brands while maintaining the appearance of independence, the business of alcohol maturing into a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, touching agriculture and manufacturing and hospitality and retail, employing millions, generating tax revenue that governments depend upon. Climate change began affecting production, warming temperatures pushing viable growing regions for grapes poleward and to higher elevations, traditional wine areas becoming too hot, cool climate regions suddenly able to ripen varieties that previously struggled, precipitation patterns shifting, droughts in some places and floods in others, producers adapting or relocating, ancient appellations facing existential questions about their future. And so I find myself thinking about continuity, about how this story of fermentation and transformation stretches in an unbroken line from those first accidental discoveries in Neolithic villages to the bottles on shelves today, how the fundamental process remains unchanged even as our understanding and our techniques have evolved beyond what those early brewers could have imagined. The yeast doing its invisible work now is the same organism that converted sugars 10,000 years ago, the same biological imperative, the same metabolic pathway, consuming and excreting, living and dying in the sweet liquid we provide, creating as a byproduct of its existence the compound that has shaped so much of human history. There is something profound in this, in the way we have partnered with these microscopic fungi, cultivating them, protecting them, creating environments where they can thrive, learning to read the signs of their activity, the bubbling and foaming, the gradual clearing, the changing aroma that signals transformation is complete. This relationship exists at a scale we cannot see, billions of individual organisms working in concert, each one a complete living thing with its own cellular machinery, yet their collective action producing something that affects us at the level of consciousness, of culture, of civilization itself. I think about how alcohol has always existed at boundaries between nature and culture, between the wild processes of fermentation and the controlled techniques of brewing and winemaking, between the sacred and the profane, between medicine and poison, between social lubricant and social destroyer. It is never just one thing, never simple, always carrying multiple meanings depending on context, on quantity, on intention. The wine poured in libation to the gods, the beer shared among friends, the whiskey that numbs pain or celebrates victory, the champagne that marks beginnings, the sake that seals agreements, each instance the same substance performing different cultural work. And there is the paradox at the heart of it, that the same drink can bring people together and tear them apart, can facilitate connection and enable isolation, can be part of joyous celebration and desperate escape, can represent sophistication and loss of control, hospitality and addiction, tradition and destruction. The question of why humans have maintained this relationship despite the costs, despite the hangovers and the health risks and the social problems and the individual tragedies, is perhaps answered by the question itself, because alcohol does so many things, serves so many purposes, operates at so many levels simultaneously. It is calories and hydration in societies where water was unsafe and food scarce. It is currency and commodity in economic systems. It is offering and sacrament in religious practice. It is marker of status and expression of taste. It is social ritual and personal pleasure. It is performance enhancer and performance destroyer. It is truth serum and forgetfulness. It is courage and recklessness. Perhaps no other substance has been asked to do so much, to carry so much meaning, to serve so many functions across so many cultures over so many millennia. And perhaps that is why it persists, because it is woven so deeply into the fabric of what it means to be human, to gather, to celebrate, to mourn, to mark the passages of time and life. I find myself thinking about the knowledge embedded in traditional practices, in the timing of harvest and the methods of fermentation, in the recipes passed down through generations, in the songs that preserve brewing instructions, in the rituals that surround drinking, all of this accumulated wisdom about how to work with these processes, how to achieve desired results, how to avoid disasters. This knowledge was hard-won, built up through countless experiments, successes and failures, through attention to detail and patience, and the willingness to learn from what went wrong, through sharing observations and comparing notes, through the slow refinement that comes from doing something again and again with slight variations until excellence emerges. And much of this knowledge is ecological, about the relationship between climate and crop, between soil and flavor, about the microorganisms that live in a particular place, the wild yeasts that settle on grape skins in one valley but not another, the bacteria that contribute to the character of a beer or a wine, the invisible ecosystem that makes each place's products distinctive. Modern science can explain these things now, can sequence the DNA of local yeast strains, can analyze soil composition and correlate it with flavor compounds, can map the geographic distribution of microorganisms, but the knowledge existed first in practice, in the hands and tongues of people who worked with these materials, who learned to recognize quality and to replicate conditions that produced it. There is also the aesthetic dimension, the appreciation of alcohol as more than just its effects, the cultivation of taste and discernment, the language that has developed to describe flavors and aromas and textures, earthy and floral and spicy and mineral, smooth and harsh and balanced and complex, the whole vocabulary of sensory evaluation This aesthetic appreciation reaches back centuries to Greek symposiasts debating the merits of different wines, to Chinese poets celebrating the clarity of their rice wine, to Persian scholars writing treatises on distillation, to medieval monks rating vintages, an unbroken tradition of paying attention, of finding pleasure and meaning in subtle differences, of developing expertise and sharing it. And there are the rituals, the toast that punctuates gathering, the clinking of glasses, the pouring of rounds, the buying of drinks as gesture of friendship or gratitude or apology, the ceremonial first sip, the final nightcap, all these small structured moments that use alcohol to create social bonds, to acknowledge relationships, to mark transitions. These rituals vary across cultures, but share common elements. The sharing itself as important as the substance shared. The act of drinking together as statement of trust and solidarity. The recognition that to drink with someone is to enter into a form of communion, to become vulnerable together, to lower guards and cross boundaries that usually separate. Perhaps this is part of alcohol's enduring appeal, that it facilitates a kind of temporary community, a loosening of the usual constraints that keep people isolated, a warmth that spreads through the group as inhibitions fade and conversation flows more easily, laughter coming more readily, connections forming that might not otherwise happen. But always there is the other side, the excess that tips celebration into chaos, the dependence that turns pleasure into compulsion, the harm done under influence, words spoken that cannot be unsaid, actions taken that cannot be undone, the morning after with its physical and emotional reckoning. The history of alcohol is also a history of this tension, of societies trying to find the balance, to preserve the benefits while limiting the harms, through law and custom and education, through taxation and regulation, through moral suasion and medical intervention, never quite succeeding, but continuing to try, because the substance is too valuable to abandon, but too dangerous to ignore. And perhaps there is wisdom in that continuing effort, in the recognition that this is not something to be solved once and for all, but something to be managed, negotiated, balanced differently in different times and places, according to different values and different assessments of risk and benefit. The story continues. New chapters being written even now, new techniques being developed, new products being created, old traditions being revived or reinvented, the craft movement growing in some places while consolidation continues in others, health consciousness rising while consumption patterns shift, climate change forcing adaptations while technology offers new possibilities. But beneath all this change, the fundamental thing remains constant, the transformation of sugar into alcohol, the patient work of yeast in the darkness, the slow alchemy that turns grain and grape and agave into something that has accompanied humanity through its entire journey from scattered bands to global civilization. And there is something almost comforting in that continuity, in knowing that the beer drunk in a modern craft brewery has its ancestors in the thick brews of ancient Sumer, that the wine poured at a contemporary dinner table connects to rituals performed in Egyptian temples and Greek symposia and medieval monasteries, that every bottle and every glass carries within it this vast history, this deep relationship between humans and the processes of fermentation. I let my thoughts settle like sediment in a fermenting vessel, like the quiet that comes after the bubbling stops, and the work is done. And I think about how appropriate it is that this story has no clear ending, because it continues in every vineyard and brewery and distillery, in every toast and every sip, in the ongoing dance between nature and culture, between control and surrender, between the wild yeast floating on the air and the careful hands that guide the transformation. The vessels wait in the darkness, in cellars and caves and climate-controlled warehouses, in oak barrels and steel tanks and clay amphorae, holding their precious liquids as time does its slow work, as flavors mellow and integrate and evolve, as something new emerges from the marriage of ingredients and technique and patience. And perhaps that patience is part of the lesson, that some transformations cannot be rushed, that we must wait for the process to unfold at its own pace, that hurrying ruins everything, that the best things come to those who can sit with the uncertainty, who can trust that what is happening in the dark is happening as it should. The night deepens, the story settles into silence, and somewhere fermentation continued invisible, inevitable, ancient as the first fallen fruit and fresh as tomorrow's batch, the yeast consuming and converting, creating and transforming, doing what it has always done, what it will always do, as long as there is sweetness and warmth and time. The thoughts drift now, like bubbles rising through fermenting liquid, like the gradual clearing that comes when the work is complete, like the quiet satisfaction of transformation achieved. And the story fades, soft as candlelight in a cellar, gentle as the settling of leaves, peaceful as the moment before sleep, when all the words have been said, and all that remains is the gentle breathing, the slow rhythm, the deep rest. I picture stone, worn smooth by countless hands, passed from one set of fingers to another across generations that stretched longer than any of us now can easily imagine. The stone is cool, dense, flecked with minerals that catch whatever light falls upon it, and it rests in a palm that knows its weight, its balance, the way it settles into the curve of a human hand as though the two were made for each other. This is the Paleolithic, a word that means old stone, ancient stone, and it encompasses a span of time so vast that our modern minds struggle to hold it, more than 2.5 million years, from the first crude tools shaped by early human ancestors to the ending of the last ice age, when glaciers finally retreated and the world began to warm into something we might recognize. I find myself thinking about duration, about the incomprehensible length of human experience contained within that single era. If we were to walk backward through time at the rate of 1 year per step, we would need to walk thousands upon thousands of miles before reaching even the tail end of the Paleolithic, and millions more to find its beginning. But numbers dissolve into something almost meaningless at that scale. So instead I think about the stone and the hand and the way a life was lived in the presence of ice and mammoth, of cave and fire, of star-filled skies that held the same constellations we see now, though the people looking up had no names for them that we would recognize. The air feels different when I imagine it, crisper perhaps, carrying scents we have lost, the particular musk of megafauna, the green sharpness of plants that no longer exist, the mineral taste of rivers running with glacial melt. I see small groups of people, 20 or 30 perhaps, moving through a landscape that shifts with the seasons, following patterns established over lifetimes, over hundreds of lifetimes, their knowledge carried not in writing but in memory, in demonstration, in the careful watching of children as their parents shape stone, prepare hide, read the signs of weather in cloud formations and wind direction. There is no rush in this world, no arbitrary divisions of hours and minutes. Time moves with the sun's arc across the sky, with the moon's phases, with the migrations of animals and the ripening of wild foods, and human activity flows within those rhythms, like water finding its course. The stone tools themselves tell stories, each one the end point of a process that began with the careful selection of the right material. Flint, perhaps, obsidian, chert, something that would fracture in predictable ways when struck with precision. And the making of a tool was not quick, not careless, but deliberate, almost meditative. The napper sitting with stone in hand, feeling for the grain, the hidden planes along which it might split, a single strike, sharp and controlled, and a flake falls away, then another, and slowly, gradually, the rough stone reveals a cutting edge, a scraping surface, a point for piercing, each tool shaped for a specific purpose, for cutting meat, for scraping hides, for digging roots, for carving wood or bone. These were not simple people living simple lives. That idea dissolves when you hold one of their tools. When you see the sophistication of their understanding, they knew materials with an intimacy we have lost, could read stone the way we read text, could see in an unworked piece of flint the knife or scraper hidden within it, waiting to be revealed. And beyond the tools, beyond the practical necessities of survival, there was something else, something that speaks to us across all those millennia with strange clarity. They made beauty. They created art. On cave walls, deep underground, they painted animals with such skill and observation that we still marvel. Bison and horses and aurochs rendered in ochre and charcoal, their bodies twisted in motion, their forms so vivid they seem almost to breathe. I imagine standing in one of those caves, far from the entrance, where daylight never reaches, holding a torch that flickers and casts moving shadows, and on the walls around me, animals appear and disappear as the flame dances, as though they are moving, running, alive in some liminal space between rock and firelight. Who were these painters? What did they think as they worked? Did they see this as sacred, as practical, as both, or as something we have no category for, no way to comprehend? The questions linger, unanswerable, beautiful in their mystery, and I find myself drawn not to definitive explanations, but to the wonder of it, the simple fact that people living tens of thousands of years ago, people who had never seen metal, who had never planted a crop or built a permanent structure, nevertheless felt compelled to create, to leave marks that would outlast them, that would speak to us now, across a gulf of time that should render us utterly alien to each other, and yet somehow does not. The deep past of the Paleolithic begins in Africa, in a landscape that was both familiar and utterly foreign to what we know now. Grasslands stretched beneath skies that had never seen smoke from factories, never heard the sound of engines. Rivers flowed through valleys where no bridge had ever stood. And in this world, the first members of the genus Homo were learning what it meant to be human. More than 2 million years ago, perhaps 2.5 million, though the dating grows uncertain at such distances, Early human ancestors began to do something remarkable. They began to modify stone deliberately, not accidentally, not randomly, but with intent, with a goal in mind. They struck one rock against another and created something new, something that had not existed before, the first technology, the first manufactured objects in the human story. These earliest tools were simple, crude, even by later standards, but they represented a threshold crossed, a line between using what nature provided and actively reshaping the world. The tools are called Oldowan, named for Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first recognized, and they consist mostly of sharp flakes struck from larger stones, and the cores from which those flakes were removed, basic, functional, effective. Imagine the cognitive leap required, the moment when an early human looked at a stone and saw not just a stone but a possibility, saw that if struck in a particular way it would yield a sharp edge, saw that this edge could cut through hide that fingers alone could not tear, could scrape meat from bone more efficiently than teeth, could open access to foods previously unavailable. This was not instinct. Animals use tools. Otters crack shells with rocks. Crows drop nuts onto roads to break them. But this was different. This required planning, foresight, the ability to hold in mind an object that did not yet exist, and then bring it into being through a sequence of deliberate actions. And once begun, the tradition continued, parent to child, generation to generation. The knowledge of stoneworking passed along through demonstration and practice. A young one watching an elder, seeing the angle of the strike, the force required, the way to read the stone's surface for the best point of impact. Time moved slowly in those early millennia. Change occurred across spans we can barely conceive. Tens of thousands of years might pass with tool technology remaining essentially stable. The same forms repeated, the same techniques employed, because they worked, because they were sufficient for the lives being lived, and there was no imperative for constant innovation, no competition driving rapid change. The people making these tools were not quite like us. Homo habilis, handyman, with brains larger than earlier hominins, but still smaller than ours, or Homo erectus, upright man, who would eventually spread out of Africa and into Asia, carrying stone tool technology across continental distances, walking slowly, generation by generation, following food sources and favorable climates. And as they moved, as populations spread and time accumulated, the tools evolved, became more sophisticated, more refined. Somewhere around 1.5 million years ago, a new technology emerged, the Aculean, named for Saint Achul in France, and it brought with it a new form, the hand axe. These hand axes were larger than Oldowan tools, more carefully shaped, worked on both sides to create a symmetrical form, teardrop-shaped or oval, with a pointed end and a broader base that fit comfortably in the palm. They required more skill to make, more planning, more strikes in careful sequence to achieve the desired shape. What strikes me about these tools is their consistency, their almost standardized form, across vast distances and long periods of time. Hand axes found in Africa look remarkably similar to those found in Europe or Western Asia, as though there was some shared template, some ideal form held in the minds of makers separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Were they teaching each other across those distances? Unlikely, The movement of populations was too slow, the contact too infrequent. Instead, it suggests something else, that given similar materials and similar needs, the human mind tends towards similar solutions, finds the same efficient forms, recognizes the same effective proportions. A well-made hand axe is beautiful, even now, even to eyes accustomed to precision manufacturing. There is something deeply satisfying about the symmetry, the balance, the way it fits the hand. And some archaeologists have wondered whether these tools were purely functional or whether they served some other purpose as well, as displays of skill perhaps, as indicators of the maker's abilities, as objects that carried meaning beyond their immediate utility. The people of the Acheulean were living lives that revolved around movement, following animal migrations, tracking seasonal abundances of plant foods. They were hunter-gatherers in the truest sense, though we must be careful with the term hunter, because the archaeology suggests that much of their meat came from scavenging, from finding the kills of large predators and using stone tools to access parts of the carcass that other scavengers could not, breaking bones to reach the rich marrow inside, cutting away meat before the lions or hyenas returned. Fire appears in this story, though exactly when remains debated. Evidence of controlled fire use extends back perhaps 1 million years, maybe more, and it would have changed everything, provided warmth on cold nights, offered protection from predators who feared the flames, and most importantly, transformed food, made it more digestible, safer, allowed access to nutrients that raw food could not provide. I think about the first fire, not the first wildfire sparked by lightning, but the first fire deliberately maintained by human hands, the careful feeding of fuel, the guarding of embers, the knowledge that this precious thing must not be allowed to die, because making fire from scratch was still perhaps beyond their abilities. So a fire once obtained, whether from a natural source or another group, had to be kept alive, carried from camp to camp, protected like the treasure it was. Hearths begin to appear in the archaeological record, circular arrangements of stones, layers of ash, charred bones, the evidence of repeated use, of people gathering around flames as darkness fell, and in that gathering, in that circle of light pushing back the night, something social was happening, stories perhaps, or proto-stories, communication that went beyond the immediate and practical, the sharing of experience, of knowledge, of something we might almost call culture. The Paleolithic was not uniform, not a single unchanging block of time. It shifted and evolved as climates changed, as ice ages came and went. During glacial periods, ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and Asia. Sea levels dropped as water became locked in glaciers, and land bridges appeared connecting previously separated regions, allowing humans and animals to cross into new territories. Between glacial periods, the world warmed, ice retreated, forests spread, coastlines shifted as seas rose, and the people of the Paleolithic adapted, moved with the changes, altered their strategies and technologies to fit new circumstances. They were not passive victims of climate, but active responders, flexible, innovative within their own context. By 500,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, new species had emerged, Homo heidelbergensis, named for a jaw found near Heidelberg in Germany. And these people made tools that showed increasing sophistication, used fire regularly, hunted large game with wooden spears. The earliest complete hunting spears we have found date to around 300,000 years ago from a site called Schöningen in Germany, carved from spruce, balanced for throwing, preserved in ancient peat. These spears tell us about planning, about coordinated group hunting, about the ability to bring down animals much larger and more powerful than any individual human. Horses, deer, perhaps even elephants. It required cooperation, strategy, an understanding of animal behavior, the patience to wait for the right moment, the courage to close with dangerous prey. And alongside the practical, the technological, something else was emerging, evidence of care, of attention to the dead. At Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones in Spain, hundreds of thousands of years old. The remains of at least 28 individuals were found deep in a cave system, deliberately placed there, it seems, accompanied by a single beautiful hand axe made of red quartzite, unlike the other tools found at the site, suggesting perhaps it was placed there intentionally as some form of grave good, some acknowledgement that death meant something, that the dead deserved consideration. I find myself paused by this, by the weight of it, because it suggests that even these early people, so different from us in many ways, nevertheless felt something we recognize, grief perhaps, or reverence, a sense that a person who had died was not simply gone, but required some ritual, some marking of their passing. Time continued its slow accumulation. Generations lived and died. Knowledge deepened. Technologies refined. And around 300,000 years ago, our own species appeared, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, emerging in Africa with slightly larger brains, more gracile skeletons, distinctive skull shapes, but initially not particularly different in behavior from other human species already present for a long time, for more than 100,000 years. Homo sapiens made tools similar to those made by Neanderthals, by Denisovans, by other archaic humans. There was no sudden revolution, no immediate superiority, just another population among several, living, adapting, surviving, but somewhere, sometime, perhaps around 70,000 years ago, or perhaps earlier, something shifted. The archaeological record shows an increase in innovation, in symbolic behavior, in the production of art and ornament. Shell beads appear. Ochre shows evidence of processing for pigment. Long-distance trade networks begin to form, with materials like obsidian appearing hundreds of miles from their source. This is sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Though that term carries assumptions that may not be warranted, it was not necessarily sudden, not uniform across all populations. But something was changing. Human culture was elaborating, becoming more complex, more varied, more recognizably modern in its expressions. And yet, even with all this change, with all this growing complexity, the fundamental patterns of life remained. People still moved with the seasons, still followed game, still gathered plant foods, still shaped stone into tools, still sat around fires as night fell and the stars emerged overhead, living lives that to them were not primitive or simple, but full, complete, the only lives they knew or could imagine. The daily rhythm of Paleolithic life moved with a slowness that our modern minds find difficult to inhabit. There was no separation between work and life, between productive time and leisure, between the sacred and the mundane. Everything flowed together in a continuous stream of activity dictated by necessity, by opportunity, by the endless cycle of seasons. Morning arrived with gradual light, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to pale gray, and people stirred from sleep in whatever shelter they had constructed. Caves, when available, though caves were not as common as we sometimes imagine. More often it was temporary structures, frameworks of branches covered with hides, simple windbreaks of piled stone, whatever provided protection from wind and rain and the cold that came with nightfall. The fire from the previous evening might still hold embers carefully banked before sleep, covered with ash to preserve the coals through the dark hours, and the first task of morning was often to coax those embers back to flame, adding dry grass, small twigs, blowing gently to encourage the oxygen flow, watching as smoke rose, and then, finally, a small flame caught and grew. Food was the constant preoccupation, not in the anxious way we sometimes experience hunger now, but as the organizing principle of existence, where to find it, how to obtain it, how to process it, how to share it. These questions shaped every day, every decision, every movement across the landscape. For much of the Paleolithic, for the vast majority of that immense span of time, people lived in small mobile groups, probably between 20 and 50 individuals, though the exact numbers would have fluctuated with seasons and circumstances. These groups were not isolated. They encountered other groups, traded with them, exchanged members through marriage or adoption, maintained social networks that extended across considerable distances. The women, and here I must acknowledge that we are generalizing from limited evidence, from ethnographic parallels with recent hunter-gatherer societies, from the patterns we can discern in bones and tools. The women likely spent much of their time gathering plant foods, roots and tubers dug from the earth with weighted digging sticks, nuts collected and carried in leather bags or woven containers, berries picked when ripe, seeds gathered and perhaps ground into crude flour using stone mortars and pestles. This gathering was not simple or unskilled. It required encyclopedic knowledge of plants, which were edible and which poisonous, which parts could be eaten and which must be avoided, when each plant was at its peak, how to process foods that were toxic raw but nutritious when properly prepared. This knowledge was vast, complex, essential for survival, and it was learned over years of observation and instruction. The men, and again, we must hold these categories lightly, likely spent more time hunting, though women hunted too in many societies, and men gathered. The divisions were not rigid, but there were patterns, tendencies, and hunting in the Paleolithic required patience that bordered on meditation, tracking animals across long distances, reading signs invisible to untrained eyes, a bent blade of grass, a partial print in soft earth, the direction of travel inferred from the spacing of marks, the age of the trail estimated from how the edges of tracks had weathered. Sometimes hunting meant waiting, concealed near a water source or along a known game trail, staying motionless for hours, breathing slowly, becoming part of the landscape, until the moment came, the deer or horse within range, and then the explosion of motion, the spear thrown or thrust, the animal fleeing or falling, the chase if it ran wounded, the careful approach if it dropped, the quick end if it still lived. But hunting was uncertain, dangerous, often unsuccessful, and the gathered foods, the roots and nuts and seeds. These provided the stable foundation of the diet, the reliable calories that kept people alive when hunting failed, as it often did, for days or weeks at a time. When a large animal was killed, it became the center of intense activity. Butchering had to happen quickly before scavengers arrived. Before the meat began to spoil, stone tools came out, the carefully maintained knives and scrapers, and the animal was systematically dismantled, hide removed in large sections, meat cut from bones, organs extracted and distributed, nothing wasted, everything used. The liver might be eaten immediately, raw and warm, rich with nutrients, the tongue, the brain, delicacies that would not keep, shared among those present, according to complex rules of distribution that varied from group to group but always existed, always governed who received what, who got the choicest portions, who was obligated to share with whom. Bones were cracked open for marrow, the rich fatty substance inside scooped out and consumed, providing calories and nutrients impossible to obtain otherwise. Tendons were carefully removed and set aside. They would be dried and used as cordage, as thread for sewing hides, as backing for composite tools. The hide itself was precious. It required days of work to transform from raw skin to usable leather. First, it had to be cleaned, scraped free of fat and tissue, using specialized stone scrapers, held taut by several people or pegged to the ground, the scraper drawn across the surface again and again, removing every trace of meat, every bit of membrane. Then it might be treated with brain matter, the animal's own brain, mixed with water to create a paste, worked into the hide, the enzymes and oils in the brain, breaking down the proteins, beginning the transformation from stiff skin to supple leather. This knowledge that brains could tan hides seems almost magical, and yet it was known, understood, practiced across continents and millennia. The hide would be worked, stretched, softened through repeated manipulation, sometimes smoked over a fire to give it water resistance, to preserve it, to add durability, and finally it became clothing, blankets, shelter material, bags, cordage, the product of days or weeks of labor, irreplaceable, maintained and repaired until it finally wore through and could serve no more. Clothing in colder climates was sophisticated, carefully tailored, sewn with bone needles using sinew thread. Evidence from later in the Paleolithic shows fitted garments with sleeves, with hoods, designed to trap body heat and shed moisture, decorated with beads or carved bone, practical and beautiful, serving both physical and social needs. Tools required constant maintenance and replacement, stone dulls with use, edges chip and break, and so there was always knapping to be done, sitting in good light, stone and hammerstone in hand, the rhythmic sound of percussion ringing across the camp, flakes flying, piling up around the napper's feet, each tool made fresh or old tools resharpened. The waste flakes themselves sometimes used for quick cutting tasks before being discarded. Different stones were preferred for different purposes. Flint was prized where available, obsidian even more so. Volcanic glass that could be worked to edges sharper than modern surgical steel. But these materials were not everywhere, and so people used what they could find. Chert, quartzite, whatever stone would fracture predictably and hold an edge, and they learned the properties of each, the way it felt, the sound it made when struck, the angle required to remove flakes cleanly. Sometimes they traveled long distances to obtain good stone, or traded with other groups who had access to it. Materials moved across landscapes through networks of exchange. Obsidian from a single volcanic source might end up hundreds of miles away, passing from group to group, each exchange strengthening social bonds, creating obligations, maintaining relationships that might prove crucial in times of scarcity. Wood was worked too, though it rarely survives in the archaeological record. Spears were carefully shaped, hafts created for stone tools, digging sticks weighted with pierced stones, containers carved from burls, all of it biodegradable, all of it vanished, leaving only rare glimpses in waterlogged sites where organic materials were preserved by lack of oxygen. Fire was tended constantly, never allowed to die if it could be helped. Later in the Paleolithic, people could create fire, striking flint against iron pyrite to create sparks, or using friction. A wooden drill spun rapidly against a wooden base until the friction generated enough heat to ignite tinder. But both methods required skill, patience, the right materials, and it was always easier to maintain existing fire than to make it anew. Around the fire in the evening, after the day's work, there was time for other things, for social grooming, for the telling of stories, though we cannot know what those stories contained, for the making of art, carved figures of animals or voluptuous human forms, the famous Venus figurines, their meaning debated but their presence undeniable, found across Europe and beyond, carved from ivory or bone or stone, small enough to carry, created with care and skill. Music, too. Bone flutes have been found, carefully drilled with finger holes, capable of producing multiple notes, able to carry melody, and we must imagine the sound in the darkness, simple tunes perhaps, or complex ones, we cannot know. But the presence of music seems certain, the human voice raised in song, hands clapping rhythm, feet stamping, the universal expressions of culture, finding form even in the deep past. Children were present in all of this, learning through observation and participation, a child watching a parent nap stone, trying it themselves with small pieces, learning through failure and guidance, a child following adults on gathering expeditions, learning to identify plants, to know what was safe, to understand the landscape. Childhood in the Paleolithic was likely both freer and more dangerous than our modern version. Free in that children were not separated from adult activities, not excluded or protected from the realities of survival, but dangerous because injury and illness that we can easily treat were often fatal, and predators were real threats, not hypothetical dangers. The landscape itself was different, populated with megafauna we can barely imagine, mammoths moving in herds across the tundra, woolly rhinoceros, cave bears massive beyond modern bears, cave lions, giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet, saber-toothed cats in some regions and times. The Paleolithic world was crowded with large animals, and humans were not yet the dominant species. Just one among many, clever and adaptable, but not yet in control. Seasons governed everything. In the far north, where Ice Age glaciers advanced and retreated, summers were brief but intensely productive. Plants grew rapidly. Animals migrated north to feed on the abundance, and humans followed, taking advantage of the seasonal plenty, hunting, gathering, preparing for the winter that would inevitably come. Winter was survival, stores of dried meat, smoked fish, nuts gathered during autumn and cached in cool, dry places. And still there was hunger, times when food ran low, when hunting failed, when the stored foods proved insufficient, and people grew thin, relied on their fat reserves, on their knowledge of marginal foods, on anything that could provide calories. In warmer regions, the seasonal variation was less extreme but still present. Rainy seasons and dry seasons, times of abundance and times of scarcity, migrations following the patterns. Coastal populations might exploit sea resources, shellfish gathered from tidal zones, fish caught in weirs or with hooks carved from bone, seals hunted on beaches, different strategies, different knowledge, but the same fundamental pattern of life, mobile, responsive, deeply embedded in the cycles of the natural world. Around 40,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, something remarkable began to happen in Europe. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, who had been present in Africa and parts of Asia for much longer, began to arrive in significant numbers, moving westward, encountering populations that had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals, who were not the brutish creatures of early imagination, but sophisticated people with their own technologies, their own cultures, their own ways of being human. For a time, these populations coexisted, perhaps 10,000 years or more, occupying the same landscapes, using similar resources, and the genetic evidence tells us they did more than simply coexist. They interbred, exchanged genes, so that most modern humans outside of Africa carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA, evidence written in our very cells of meetings, of relationships, of children born from unions between populations we now classify as separate species, but who were perhaps not quite so separate after all. The meeting of these peoples, what did it look like? Was it peaceful, hostile, indifferent? Probably all of these at different times and places. Exchanges of technology occurred. Neanderthals began using some tools more typical of modern humans. Modern humans may have learned cold weather survival strategies from Neanderthals who had been adapting to European climates for millennia. Knowledge flowed both ways, techniques shared, innovations spreading through contact and observation. But eventually, by around 40,000 years ago in some areas, 30,000 in others, the Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record. Their populations dwindled. Their distinctive tools ceased to be made. Their genes persisted only as small fractions in the genomes of other humans, and the reasons remain debated. Climate change, competition for resources, absorption through interbreeding, disease, probably no single cause but a combination, a gradual fading rather than a sudden catastrophe. And with their departure, Homo sapiens became the only human species, the sole survivors of a genus that had once been diverse, that had included many forms, many experiments in how to be human, all gone now except us, carrying forward alone into the future. This later period of the Paleolithic, sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, was marked by an explosion of cultural innovation. Cave art reached its peak, the famous painted caves of France and Spain, Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, deep underground chambers where artists created images of breathtaking beauty and skill, horses galloping, bison charging, hands stenciled in negative space by blowing pigment around them, leaving the ghostly outlines pressed against stone, The artists who made these paintings understood perspective, shading, how to use the natural contours of the cave walls to give their animals dimension, movement. They mixed pigments from minerals, ochres for reds and yellows, manganese for blacks, charcoal for deep darks, ground them to powder, mixed them with animal fat or water, applied them with fingers with primitive brushes made from animal hair, with hollow bones used as spray tubes, working by flickering torchlight in chambers sometimes requiring difficult crawls through narrow passages to reach. They created galleries that still astonish us, still move us, the same images viewed tens of thousands of years apart, carrying meaning across an abyss of time we can measure but not truly bridge. Why they made these paintings remains mysterious. Were they shamanic, religious, educational, aesthetic, territorial markers, or something else entirely? Something we have no framework to understand. The paintings themselves cannot tell us. They simply exist, beautiful and mute, inviting interpretation but resisting certainty. Portable art became more common too. Carved figurines, decorated tools, bone carved with elaborate geometric patterns or images of animals, ivory beads strung into necklaces, shells pierced for suspension, brought from coastal areas far inland, traded over long distances, valued for their beauty, their rarity, their symbolic weight. Musical instruments became more sophisticated, flutes carved from bird bones, mammoth ivory, producing clear notes, capable of melody, and we must imagine the sound carried on the wind, echoing in caves, accompanying ceremonies we cannot reconstruct, marking moments of significance, celebration, mourning, transition. Burial practices became more elaborate, bodies placed in graves with care, arranged in particular positions, accompanied by objects, tools, ornaments, ochre sprinkled over the deceased, the red powder perhaps symbolizing life, blood, vitality, or simply beautiful, or both, or neither, the symbolic content forever uncertain, but the care itself undeniable. Some burials were especially rich, individuals interred with many objects, suggesting perhaps that social differentiation was increasing, that some people held special status, were recognized as leaders, shamans, skilled craftspeople, or were simply beloved, honored, mourned with particular intensity. Tool technology continued to evolve. Blades became longer, more standardized, struck from carefully prepared cores, creating multiple cutting edges from a single piece of stone. Efficient, elegant, a sophisticated understanding of stone's properties. Backed blades appeared, with one edge deliberately blunted so the tool could be held or hafted safely. Microliths emerged, tiny stone tools that could be set in rows along wooden or bone handles, creating composite tools, saws, arrows, harpoons. The bow and arrow appeared, though exactly when is debated, perhaps 20,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, transforming hunting, allowing kills from greater distances, reducing danger to the hunter, increasing success rates, and requiring new skills. The making of bows with the right tension, arrows that flew straight, tips that penetrated deeply, atlatls, spear throwers, extended the reach and power of thrown spears, a wooden shaft with a hook at one end that held the butt of a spear, lengthening the throwing arm, increasing velocity. Some were carved with elaborate decorations, animals emerging from the wood, functional tools elevated to art, practical and beautiful inseparably merged. Needles appeared in the archaeological record, finely made from bone or ivory, with eyes drilled through for thread, enabling the creation of fitted clothing, essential in the coldest regions, where survival through winter required sophisticated protection from the elements, where poorly made clothing could mean death, and well-made clothing meant comfort, warmth, the ability to hunt and gather even in harsh conditions. The end of the Paleolithic approached slowly, unevenly, arriving at different times in different places, as the great ice sheets began their final retreat. Around 15,000 years ago, the warming began, accelerating around 12,000 years ago, the climate shifting into something warmer, wetter in many regions, more stable. Megafauna began to disappear, the great mammoths, the woolly rhinos, the giant deer going extinct one by one, whether from climate change, from human hunting pressure, from disease, from habitat loss, as forests replaced tundra, probably all of these contributing in different proportions, leaving ecosystems fundamentally altered, impoverished of the giants that had defined them. Humans adapted, as they had always adapted, shifting strategies, focusing on smaller game, increasing reliance on plant foods, fish, shellfish. In the Middle East, around 12,000 years ago, people began to experiment with cultivating plants, wild cereals that could be encouraged, protected, eventually selected for traits that made them easier to harvest, larger seeds, non-shattering heads that didn't drop their grain before collection. The first permanent settlements appeared, people building structures that were meant to last, storing food through seasons, investing in particular places rather than moving constantly. The mobility that had defined the Paleolithic beginning to slow, to root itself, to transform into something different. Around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas, a brief return to colder conditions, challenged these emerging agricultural communities, but they persisted, adapted, and when the cold released its grip and warmth returned, farming spread, villages grew, population increased, and the Paleolithic, that immense span of human time, began to fade into something new. The transition was not sudden, not uniform. Hunter-gatherers persisted in many regions for thousands of years more, some communities combining farming with hunting and gathering, some adopting agriculture and abandoning it when it failed, returning to older patterns. But the overall trajectory was set. The world was warming, changing, and human societies were changing with it. By 10,000 years ago, in some regions, the Paleolithic was effectively over, replaced by the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, characterized by smaller tools, more intensive use of resources, increasing sedentism, and then by the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, with its polished axes, its pottery, its domesticated animals and cultivated crops, its villages becoming towns, becoming cities. But for more than 2 million years before that transformation, for 99% of human existence, the Paleolithic was the human story, mobile groups, stone tools, fire and shelter, the long, slow accumulation of knowledge, the patient adaptation to changing climates and landscapes, the development of art and music and symbolic thought, the caring for the dead, the creation of culture in its earliest forms, and something in us still carries that past, still responds to fire, to stars overhead, to the satisfaction of skilled handwork, to the taste of food cooked over flames, to stories told in darkness, to the bond between people who depend on each other for survival. The Paleolithic is not simply history, not merely the past, but foundation, the deep time that shaped what we are, that made possible everything that came after. I find myself thinking about time again, not as something measured in minutes or hours, but as the Paleolithic people might have experienced it, cyclical rather than linear, marked by the moon's phases, the sun's annual journey, the return of migrating herds, the opening of flowers, the freezing of rivers, the thawing of ice. Each year was not merely a repeat of the previous, not identical, but similar enough that knowledge accumulated, patterns recognized, an unusually cold winter remembered, a year when the berries were particularly abundant. The summer, the great herd took a different route, all held in memory, passed along in stories, becoming the collective wisdom of the group. And within that cyclical time, there was deep time, the sense that things had always been this way, that ancestors stretching back beyond counting had lived these same rhythms, made these same tools, followed these same paths. The weight of tradition must have been enormous, not oppressive necessarily, but grounding, stabilizing, a reassurance that the ways that had worked before would work again. Innovation happened, obviously. The archaeological record proves it, but slowly, gradually, a slight modification to a tool design, adopted, refined, eventually becoming standard, then modified again generations or centuries later, change accumulating in layers so thin that no single lifetime would have noticed much difference. And yet, over millennia, the transformation was profound. What did they think about these people as they sat by fires or walked across grasslands? We cannot know their thoughts, cannot recover their inner lives, but they had the same brains we do, the same capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for imagination. They must have asked questions. Where do the animals go when they migrate? What are the stars? What happens after death? What makes thunder? Why does fire burn? And they must have created answers. Stories that explained, that gave meaning, that connected the visible world to invisible forces. Spirits, perhaps. Ancestors watching from beyond. Animals with souls and intentions. Plants with preferences. A world alive and conscious, populated with beings both seen and unseen, both physical and supernatural. Shamans may have mediated between worlds, individuals with particular gifts, ability to enter trance states, to communicate with spirits, to heal, to divine the future, to call the animals to the hunt. These practices are found in hunter-gatherer societies around the world and may extend deep into the Paleolithic, though the evidence is ambiguous, suggestive, but not definitive. The cave paintings themselves may have been shamanic, created in altered states, in the depths of dark caves where sensory deprivation and flickering light could induce visions, where the boundary between this world and other worlds grew thin, where the animals painted on stone might seem to move, to breathe, to cross over from a spirit into matter and back again. Music and dance may have been technologies of transcendence, ways to alter consciousness, to achieve states where normal reality loosened its grip, where ecstasy became possible, where the group could bond in shared rhythm, shared movement, shared emotion that transcended individual experience. And in all of this, in the practical and the spiritual, in the technological and the artistic, in the daily and the extraordinary, There was something profoundly human, recognizable across all the millennia, that separate us. These people were not aliens, not incomprehensible others, but kin, family, the same species capable of the same range of experiences, joy and sorrow, love and loss, curiosity and contentment, fear and courage. They held their children as we hold ours, felt grief when someone died, experienced the pleasure of a meal after hunger, the relief of shelter from storm, the satisfaction of work well done, the comfort of companionship, the ache of loneliness, all the fundamental human experiences that unite us across time, across cultures, across all the superficial differences that might seem to divide. The Paleolithic teaches us about resilience, about adaptability, about the capacity of humans to survive and even thrive in conditions we would consider impossible. They lived through ice ages, through dramatic climate shifts, through ecological upheavals that eliminated entire species, and they persisted, adjusted, innovated just enough to continue, to endure, to pass life forward to the next generation and the next and the next, an unbroken chain of survival extending across hundreds of thousands of years. It teaches us about sufficiency, about living within limits, taking what was needed but not more, because more could not be stored indefinitely, could not be accumulated. Mobility required traveling light, taking only what could be carried. And in that necessity, there was a kind of freedom, freedom from the weight of possessions, from the anxiety of protecting wealth, from the complexity of managing excess. It teaches us about community, about interdependence, about the necessity of cooperation for survival. No one could live alone in the Paleolithic. Isolation meant death. The group was essential, and so social bonds were not optional luxuries, but fundamental requirements. And perhaps because of that necessity, those bonds were strong, deep, maintained with care and attention. And it teaches us about slowness, about patience, about the long view. Nothing happened quickly in the Paleolithic. Tool traditions remained stable for millennia. Populations grew at glacial pace. Knowledge accumulated grain by grain, and in that slowness there was perhaps a kind of peace, an absence of the rushing urgency that characterizes our modern lives, time to observe, to notice, to be present in the moment, because there was nowhere else to be, nothing else demanding attention. The ending of the Paleolithic, the transition to agriculture and settled life, brought tremendous changes: population growth, technological acceleration, the rise of cities and civilizations, writing and mathematics, art and architecture on scales previously impossible, all the achievements we celebrate, all the complexity we inhabit, but it also brought new problems: social stratification, warfare on organized scales, epidemic disease, environmental degradation, the anxieties of surplus and scarcity, the burdens of ownership and inheritance. The Paleolithic had its own hardships, its own dangers and difficulties, but it avoided some of the pathologies that would emerge later. Neither way of life was perfect, neither purely good nor purely bad. Each had its costs and benefits, its joys and sorrows, but the Paleolithic represents something irreplaceable, a way of being human that worked, that sustained our species through almost our entire existence, that shaped our bodies, our minds, our social instincts, our emotional lives in ways we still carry still express, still feels resonating in moments when we gather around fires, when we work with our hands, when we walk in wild places under open skies. And now that way of life is gone, preserved only in archaeology, in the rare communities of hunter-gatherers that persist in marginal environments, in the deep memories our bodies and brains still hold. The Paleolithic has ended, faded into history, become the foundation upon which everything else was built, the long, slow beginning of the human story, the deep time that made us what we are. I think of the stone again, the one I began with, cool and dense and shaped by careful hands, resting in a palm that knew its weight. And I imagine all the hands that held stones like it, across all those millennia, millions of hands, billions of moments, each one holding the same fundamental reality, the need to survive, the desire to continue, the hope that tomorrow would come and bring with it another chance to live, to love, to endure. The fire burns low now in this imagined scene, the flames reducing to coals, the light dimming, the shadows deepening, and around the last warmth of the hearth, people settle into rest, their day done, their work completed as much as it can be, knowing tomorrow will bring its own tasks, its own challenges, its own small victories. The stars overhead continue their slow wheel, the same stars the Paleolithic people watched, turning through the same patterns, marking time on a scale that makes even the Paleolithic seem brief, and under those stars, in darkness, held back by dying embers, the long story continues, breath by breath, generation by generation, carrying forward into futures unknown and unknowable. The stone rests, waiting, patient, knowing nothing but its own solidity, its own endurance. And in that simple persistence there is something profound, something that needs no words, no explanation, only acknowledgement, only the quiet recognition that it was here, that they were here, that the long, slow story of stone and hand and fire actually happened, actually was, actually laid the foundation for everything that followed, including this moment, this reflection, this gentle fading into silence. There is a place where dreams are built in wood and steel, where imagination becomes something you can walk through, touch, see reflected in a child's widening eyes. It begins as an idea, a whisper of possibility, the notion that wonder itself might be constructed, that joy could be engineered, that entire worlds might spring forth from nothing more than vision and determination. Picture a field, an empty stretch of land. Perhaps it sits quiet beneath a pale sky, waiting. The grass moves gently in a breeze that carries with it the faint scent of earth and possibility. There is nothing here yet, only potential, only the space where something extraordinary might one day stand. This is where it always starts, in emptiness, in the moment before creation, when the ground holds no footprints, when the air carries no laughter, when the horizon stretches unbroken and still. But someone stands here, looking out across this blank canvas, and they see something different. They see pathways winding through gardens that don't exist yet, towers rising into air that remains clear and unobstructed. They hear music that hasn't been composed, voices that haven't yet arrived, the echo of joy that exists only in imagination. The history of these places, these kingdoms of make-believe made real, begins long before the first gate ever swings open, long before the first ticket is ever sold. It begins in the space between what is and what could be, in the mind of someone who dared to believe that enchantment was something that could be shared, multiplied, given form. Centuries ago, there were simpler pleasures. Village fairs that appeared with the changing seasons, traveling entertainers who brought wonder from town to town, wooden horses carved by hand, painted in bright colors that caught the light, gardens designed for strolling, fountains where people gathered just to watch water dance in sunlight. These were the seeds, the earliest hints of what would come, small moments of escape woven into the fabric of everyday life. A merchant might set up a curious machine, something that spun or lifted or created the illusion of flight. Children would gather, eyes bright with fascination, and for a moment, just a moment, the ordinary world would fall away. In Copenhagen, in the 1800s, there was a garden, Tivoli. It opened its gates in 1843, and people walked through into something they had never quite experienced before, not merely a garden, but a designed experience. Lanterns hung from trees like captured stars. Stages presented performances that ranged from music to pantomime. There were fireworks that painted the night sky in cascading colors, and everywhere, there was the sense that this was a world apart, a pocket of enchantment carved out of the everyday. This was revolutionary. The idea that pleasure could be curated, that an entire environment could be crafted specifically to transport people beyond their daily concerns. The gardens weren't wild. They were imagined, planned, each pathway leading somewhere intentional, each view composed like a painting, and people came. They walked these paths, sat in these gardens, watched these performances, and something shifted in their understanding of what was possible. Entertainment wasn't just something that happened to you. It could be something you entered into, walked through, became part of. Across the ocean in America, other seeds were taking root. Coney Island, a stretch of shoreline that would become synonymous with spectacle and sensation by the late 1800s. It had transformed from a quiet beach into something wilder, more ambitious. There were mechanical rides powered by steam, enormous structures built purely for the thrill of experiencing them, towers you could climb, wheels that lifted you high above the ground, giving you a view of the world from an angle you'd never known before. The air there smelled of salt water and roasted peanuts, of machinery and excitement. There was a rawness to it, an exuberance. These weren't refined gardens with classical music. These were experiments in sensation, in pushing the boundaries of what the human body could experience and still call fun. But even in that chaos, that carnival energy, there was something being learned, something about how people moved through space, what drew them forward, what made them linger, what made them return. The operators of these attractions were studying human nature, learning to read desire, to anticipate wonder. And someone was watching all of this very carefully, taking notes, imagining something different, something that combined the refinement of the gardens with the excitement of the mechanical rides, something that told stories, that didn't just offer sensation, but meaning, narrative, worlds complete unto themselves. The 20th century was dawning, and with it would come a transformation. The empty fields would fill, the quiet spaces would bloom with color and sound and movement, and the places where dreams are built would begin to rise, permanent, substantial, each one a testament to the belief that wonder is not something we outgrow, but something we carry with us, waiting for the right moment, the right place to let it soar once more. The name that would change everything belonged to a man who understood stories, Walter Elias Disney. Born in 1901 in Chicago, raised in a world that was itself transforming, moving from gas lamps to electric lights, from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, he grew up watching the world reinvent itself, and perhaps that taught him that reinvention was possible, that what seemed fixed could be reimagined entirely. He drew pictures, told stories through moving images, created a mouse that would become more famous than most human beings. But the canvas of film wasn't enough. He wanted something more, something that existed in 3 dimensions, something you could walk through with your own feet, touch with your own hands. In the early 1950s, he began to dream of a place. He called it Disneyland, and it would be unlike anything that had come before. Not a collection of rides scattered haphazardly, not a carnival midway with games of chance and dubious operators, but a complete environment, a story made physical, where every detail served the larger vision. He faced skepticism. The amusement industry looked at his plans and saw disaster. They knew parks. They knew what worked, cheap thrills, mechanical rides, games with prizes. But Disney was proposing something different. He wanted to build a place that was clean, family-oriented, that told stories through its very architecture. And the industry veterans shook their heads. They had seen many things fail, and this seemed destined to join them. The money was difficult. Banks didn't understand the vision. They saw risk without precedent. No comparable model existed, but Disney had something they didn't. He had his television show, and he made a deal. A BC would help finance the park in exchange for a weekly television program, and suddenly the impossible had funding, had momentum, had a path forward. He found land in Anaheim, California. Orange groves stretched across the acreage. The trees stood in neat rows, heavy with fruit, the air thick with citrus sweetness. It was quiet land, agricultural, humble. But he stood there and saw castles, Main Street, rivers carrying boats through jungles that existed only in his imagination. The transformation began in 1954. Bulldozers arrived. The orange trees came down, their removal marking the end of one purpose and the beginning of another. The earth was moved, reshaped. Waterways were dug where no water had flowed before. Hills were constructed where the land had been flat. Reality was being bent to match the dream. And the dream was specific, extraordinarily specific. He had divided this future kingdom into lands, each one a complete environment. Main Street, USA, would evoke small-town America at the turn of the century, a nostalgic vision of a past that perhaps never quite existed but felt true nonetheless. Fantasyland would bring fairy tales to life. Adventureland would offer exotic thrills. Frontierland would capture the pioneer spirit. Tomorrowland would look toward the future with optimism and wonder. The workers who built these lands were creating something unprecedented. They weren't just construction crews. They were called Imagineers, a word that married imagination with engineering, and they had to solve problems no one had faced before. How do you make a jungle in Southern California? How do you create a castle that looks medieval but meets modern building codes? How do you hide the mundane infrastructure that keeps everything running? They developed techniques, forced perspective, made buildings seem taller than they were. The upper stories were built at smaller scales, tricking the eye, making Main Street seem more grand, more dreamlike. They planted trees that would mature quickly, creating shade and atmosphere. They designed drainage systems disguised as streams and waterfalls. Every practical necessity was hidden or transformed into part of the story. Disney himself was there constantly, walking the construction site, adjusting, refining, noticing details others might overlook. If a trash can didn't match the theming of its land, it was replaced. If a sign used the wrong typeface, it was remade. Nothing was too small to matter, because he understood that magic lived in the accumulation of details, that immersion required completeness. The opening was set for July 17th, 1955, and as that date approached, the work intensified. Crews labored through the night, painting, planting, installing. There was so much still unfinished, so much that existed only partially. Tomorrowland was particularly troubled. The future was harder to build than the past. The concrete was still wet in places. Some attractions weren't ready, but the date was fixed. Television had announced it. Thousands of people were coming, ready or not. The gates would open. That opening day became infamous. They had printed 15,000 invitations, but counterfeit tickets flooded in. Nearly 30,000 people descended on the park, far more than the unfinished grounds could handle. The temperature soared above 100 degrees. Some drinking fountains didn't work yet. A plumber's strike had forced choices, toilets or fountains. They chose toilets. The asphalt on Main Street was so fresh it stuck to women's high heels. A gas leak forced the closure of several attractions. Fantasyland, Adventureland, and Frontierland had to choose which rides could operate. It was chaos. It was disaster. The press called it Black Sunday. But something else was happening too. People were experiencing something they had never felt before, walking into a storybook, seeing characters they had only known from film walking among them, riding boats through jungles that smelled of earth and water, watching animatronic hippos rise from the river's surface, hearing their mechanical roars. Children stood before Sleeping Beauty Castle with their mouths open, not speaking, just staring, trying to reconcile the fact that this thing from their imaginations now stood solid and real before them. Parents found themselves equally transported, discovering that the appeal wasn't just for children, that there was something profound in this act of collective make-believe, this agreement to enter a world where the rules were different, where dragons might be fought and treasure might be found. Despite the disasters of opening day, people came back. They told others. Word spread. This wasn't like other amusement parks. This was something new. Within 7 weeks, 1 million people had passed through the gates. They came from across California, across America, across the world. They waited in long lines under the hot sun, and they smiled. They bought tickets and souvenirs. They ate at themed restaurants. They returned again and again. The park evolved rapidly. Disney kept changing it, adding, refining. He famously said it would never be completed, that it would continue to grow as long as there was imagination in the world, and he meant it. New attractions appeared. The Matterhorn bobsleds in 1959, a mountain that housed a roller coaster with a basketball court. Hidden at its peak for cast members on break, the submarine voyage, the monorail, each edition raising the bar, showing what was possible. Other companies watched, studied, tried to understand the formula. How had Disney succeeded where conventional wisdom said he would fail? What was the secret? They saw the cleanliness, the attention to detail, the storytelling, the training of employees, cast members who were taught they were performers, not workers, that every interaction was part of the show, but understanding intellectually and executing practically were different things. Many tried to replicate the model. They built parks with theme, with characters, with stories. Most failed. The gap between concept and execution proved vast. It wasn't enough to have a theme. You had to commit to it completely, had to maintain it, had to believe in it with every nail driven and every bush planted. Six Flags Over Texas opened in 1961, funded by real estate developer Angus Wynne. It took a different approach, historical rather than fantastical. The park was divided into sections representing the Six Flags that had flown over Texas, Spain, France, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the Confederacy, the United States, each area themed to its period, with shows and attractions matching the era. It was ambitious, well executed, and it succeeded, but it was different from Disneyland, more regional in character, more focused on thrill rides than immersive environments. It proved there was room for variation, that Disney hadn't exhausted the possibilities, just opened the door. Meanwhile, Disney was already thinking bigger. Florida. He had learned lessons from California. In Anaheim, he didn't control the land around the park. Hotels and businesses had sprung up, some cheap, some garish, breaking the illusion the moment guests left the park boundaries. In Florida, he would buy enough land to control everything, to create a complete destination, a vacation kingdom isolated from the outside world. He began secretly acquiring land in Central Florida in 1963, using dummy corporations to avoid speculation, building a property that would eventually encompass over 27,000 acres, larger than Manhattan, large enough to hold not one park, but many, hotels, golf courses, an entire resort complex, a city of imagination. But he wouldn't live to see it completed. Walt Disney died in December of 1966, lung cancer. He was 65 years old, and his dream of a Florida project was still largely unrealized. Sketches and plans, models and ambitions, but not yet real. His company faced a choice: abandon the project or push forward without him. They chose to build, to honor his vision, to prove that what he had started was larger than one man, and in doing so, they would create something that would transform Central Florida, transform the theme park industry, transform the way people thought about vacation and entertainment and the places where reality and imagination meet. The work began, the swamps were drained, the land was prepared, and slowly, impossibly, the Magic Kingdom began to rise from the Florida wetlands. Another castle, another Main Street, but bigger, more ambitious, built with all the lessons learned from Disneyland, all the improvements that time and experience had suggested. Walt Disney World opened on October 1st, 1971, and it was vast in a way that defied easy comprehension. The Magic Kingdom alone covered 100 acres, but that was just the beginning. the resort spread across property that could have held San Francisco twice over. Roads wound through carefully preserved wilderness. Lakes sparkled under the Florida sun, and at the center of it all, the park itself waited like a jewel in an enormous setting. The approach was different from California. Guests didn't simply arrive at the gates. They were transported, literally. Parking lots were located far from the park entrance, and visitors boarded either a monorail or a ferry boat, traveling across Seven Seas Lagoon, watching the park grow larger as they approached, the castle rising higher, the anticipation building with every moment. By the time they stepped onto Main Street, they had already left the ordinary world behind. This was intentional, carefully orchestrated. The transition from reality to fantasy needed space, needed time, needed physical distance, and the Florida property provided all of that. You couldn't see highways from inside the park, couldn't hear traffic. The outside world was held at bay by sheer geography, by ownership, by design. Main Street here was larger than its California counterpart, the buildings taller, the street wider, the castle at its end. Cinderella Castle soared to 189 feet, almost twice the height of Sleeping Beauty Castle in Anaheim. It dominated the skyline, visible from almost everywhere in the park, a constant reminder of where you were, what world you had entered. Inside the castle, they had created something unexpected, a restaurant, Cinderella's Royal Table, where children could dine in what felt like a medieval banquet hall. The ceiling arched overhead. Murals depicted scenes from the fairy tale. Cast members, dressed in period costume, served food. And for the duration of a meal, you inhabited the story. You were inside the narrative, looking out through windows at a kingdom spread below. But the innovations went deeper than size and spectacle. Beneath the magic kingdom, invisible to guests above, lay the utilidor, a system of tunnels that allowed cast members and supplies to move through the park without breaking the illusion. A worker dressed as a cowboy from Frontierland never had to walk through Tomorrowland. They could move underground, emerging only in their proper place, their proper time, their proper story. The waste management system was revolutionary. Trash was sucked through pneumatic tubes at 60 miles per hour, whisked away to a central collection point. Guests never saw overflowing bins, never smelled garbage rotting in the Florida heat. The cleanliness that had been a hallmark in California became even more pronounced here, almost supernatural in its consistency. The attention to horticulture reached new levels. The landscape team planted palm trees and tropical flowers, creating lush gardens that looked like they had always been there, but everything was chosen. Nothing was accidental. The colors were coordinated to bloom in sequence, ensuring visual interest throughout the year. The shapes and textures were balanced, creating compositions that would have satisfied a painter's eye. They even controlled the smells. The Smellitzer, a device that could pump specific scents into areas of the park, vanilla on Main Street, salt water near the Pirates of the Caribbean, creating invisible layers of atmosphere, engaging senses that guests didn't consciously notice, but that deepened the immersion nonetheless. And people came, in numbers that exceeded even optimistic projections. 10,000 guests passed through on opening day, but within a year, the annual attendance had reached 10 million. Families saved for months, drove for days, camped in station wagons at rest stops, all to reach this place, this destination that had become synonymous with childhood dreams and family memories. The impact on Central Florida was seismic. Orlando transformed from a quiet citrus town to a tourism capital. Hotels rose from empty land. Restaurants multiplied. Highways expanded. The economy restructured itself around the mouse, around the castle, around the dream. Other companies saw the success and wanted to replicate it, but they also saw the cost. Disney had spent $400 million, an almost incomprehensible sum, building something that couldn't be easily copied. The barrier to entry had been raised enormously. Six Flags expanded, becoming a chain. Parks opened in Georgia, in Missouri, in New Jersey, each one themed differently, but following a similar model. Regional parks with themed areas and increasingly sophisticated rides. They couldn't match Disney's immersive storytelling, but they could offer thrills, roller coasters that pushed the limits of speed and height. And there was a market for that, for pure adrenaline, for the scream rather than the smile. In Ohio, Cedar Point had been operating since 1870, but in the 1970s, it began its transformation into something new, the roller coaster capital. They built the Gemini in 1978, a racing coaster that sent two trains side by side through a course of hills and turns, and they didn't stop. Every few years, a new coaster, each one breaking some record, tallest, fastest, most inversions. The park became a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers, for people who wanted not immersion but intensity. The industry was diversifying, finding niches. Disney owned the family market, the detailed theming, the gentle magic, but others could compete on different terms, on thrills, on regional appeal, on price points that made them accessible to different demographics. In 1982, Disney opened Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Walt's vision of a functional city had been transformed into a theme park, but an unusual one, the front half. Future World featured massive pavilions sponsored by corporations. Exxon sponsored the universe of energy. General Motors sponsored the world of motion. Each pavilion was part attraction, part educational experience, part corporate showcase. The icon was Spaceship Earth, a massive geodesic sphere 180 feet in diameter. Inside, a slow-moving dark ride took guests through the history of human communication. From cave paintings to computer networks, the narration was serious, educational, voiced by Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, lending gravitas to what could have been a simple ride. The back half of Epcot, World Showcase, featured 11 pavilions representing different countries: Mexico, Norway, China, Germany, Italy, America, Japan, Morocco, France, United Kingdom, Canada, each one staffed by citizens of that nation, serving authentic food, selling native crafts, presenting cultural performances. It was theme park as permanent World's Fair, education disguised as entertainment, or perhaps entertainment elevated by education. Critics were mixed. Some found it corporate, sterile, too educational for children, not exciting enough for adults, but it drew crowds. Millions came to ride the rides, taste the foods, marvel at the ambition, and over time it would be refined, adjusted, made more entertaining, more Disney, but never quite losing that original educational impulse. Disney was proving that theme parks could be more than escapism. They could be battered vehicles for ideas, for cultural exchange, for optimistic visions of the future. And while not every experiment succeeded, the willingness to experiment itself was important. It kept the medium alive, evolving, searching for what else it could be. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another transformation was beginning. Tokyo Disneyland opened in April of 1983, the first Disney park built outside the United States. It was licensed, not owned by Disney, but built to exacting standards, overseen by Imagineers who ensured that every detail matched the quality guests expected. The Japanese embraced it with an enthusiasm that surprised even Disney. Attendance numbers soared. The park became a cultural phenomenon. Families visited multiple times a year. Young women in particular adopted the parks as a fashion destination, coordinating outfits, collecting merchandise, creating a subculture around Disney that was uniquely Japanese in its intensity and dedication. This international success opened new possibilities. If the model worked in Japan, where else might it succeed? Europe, China. The dream was becoming global, spreading across continents, adapting to different cultures while maintaining core identity. Back in America, Universal Studios was watching Disney's success with keen interest. They had theme park experience. The Universal Studios Hollywood tour had been operating since 1964, taking visitors behind the scenes of a working film studio, showing them sets and special effects. But they wanted more. They wanted a destination resort that could compete directly with Disney. They chose Orlando, building practically in Disney's backyard. Universal Studios Florida opened in June of 1990, and it brought a different sensibility. Where Disney emphasized whimsy and fantasy, Universal leaned into movies, into thrills, into darker themes. Jaws, King Kong, Earthquake. These weren't gentle stories. They were visceral, frightening, exhilarating. The execution was troubled. Many attractions weren't ready on opening day. The Jaws ride in particular suffered constant mechanical failures, breaking down multiple times daily, but Universal persisted, fixing problems, improving systems, and gradually the park found its footing, found its audience, people who wanted something edgier than Disney, something that felt more grown up, more cinematic. The competition pushed both companies to innovate. Disney responded by opening Disney MGM Studios in 1989, their own movie-themed park, featuring attractions based on Star Wars, Indiana Jones, The Twilight Zone. They were fighting for the same audience now, the same tourist dollars, and the guests benefited because competition drove creativity, drove investment, drove both companies to keep building, keep improving, keep imagining new ways to astonish. The 1990s saw an explosion of themed entertainment. New parks opened across America, across the world, each one trying to find its unique angle, its reason to exist in an increasingly crowded market. Some succeeded, many failed. The landscape was littered with ambitious projects that couldn't sustain themselves, couldn't compete with the established giants who had perfected the formulas, who had the intellectual property, the budgets, the expertise. But the successful ones, they were magnificent. They pushed boundaries, combined technology with storytelling in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined. Dark rides incorporated projection mapping. Animatronics became so sophisticated they seemed truly alive. roller coasters launched magnetically, reaching speeds that earlier engineers would have thought impossible, inversions and elements that defied gravity, that made riders scream with equal parts terror and joy. The turn of the millennium brought new ambitions, new technologies, and new understandings of what a theme park could be. Islands of Adventure opened in Orlando in 1999, Universal's second gate, and it represented a leap forward in immersive design. The park was built around a central lagoon with 5 islands, each one a complete world unto itself. Marvel's Superhero Island, Toon Lagoon, Jurassic Park, The Lost Continent, Seuss Landing. Walking from one island to another meant crossing a threshold, not just physically but atmospherically. The music changed, the architecture transformed, even the vegetation shifted to match the theme. Tropical plants in Jurassic Park, whimsical twisted trees in Seuss Landing, and the commitment to theming went deeper than Disney had typically ventured. These weren't sanitized versions of their source material. They were full-throated embracements, comic book heroes at actual scale, dinosaurs that roared with genuine menace. The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man opened as the park's flagship attraction, and it changed what people thought dark rides could be. It combined moving vehicles with 3-dimensional sets and screens, projecting computer-generated imagery that seemed to surround riders. Villains appeared to leap from buildings. Fireballs seemed to rush toward you. The vehicle tilted and spun in sync with the action, creating an illusion of movement through space that was breathtaking in its completeness. Guests emerged from that ride blinking, trying to reconcile what they had just experienced. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a ride. It was something between something new, and it set a standard that would influence attraction design for decades to come. But perhaps the most significant development of this era was still gestating, waiting to transform everything once again. Harry Potter. The books had become a global phenomenon, and film rights had been secured. The movies were breaking box office records, and theme park executives looked at this property and saw possibility, saw potential beyond anything that had come before. Disney had been offered the rights first, but they had passed. Their vision for what a Harry Potter area might be didn't align with what the author, J.K. Rowling, demanded. She wanted complete authenticity, absolute fidelity to her vision. She wanted butterbeer to taste exactly as she imagined it, wanted Hogwarts to be built to proper scale, wanted everything, every detail, to match what readers had fallen in love with. Universal said yes to those demands and began work on what would become the wizarding world of Harry Potter. It opened in Islands of Adventure in June of 2010, and the impact was immediate, seismic, transformative. They had recreated Hogsmeade, the village from the books, with such precision that walking through it felt like stepping into the pages. The shops sold actual merchandise from the wizarding world. Honeydukes offered sweets described in the books. Ollivanders sold wands, interactive wands, that could trigger effects throughout the land if you knew the proper movements, the proper spells. Hogwarts Castle loomed over everything, built at full scale, its towers and turrets reaching into the Florida sky, and inside, the ride, Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, combined robotic arms with projection domes and physical sets in a way that had never been attempted. Riders soared over Hogwarts, encountered dementors, played Quidditch, all while their bench moved in impossible ways, tilting, rotating, creating sensations of flight that felt genuinely magical. The cultural impact was unprecedented. Attendance at Universal's parks surged. Wait times for the Harry Potter attractions stretched to hours. Guests arrived before dawn, hoping to be among the first to enter, to experience this world they had loved in books and film, now made tangible, made real. Disney noticed, everyone noticed, this wasn't just a successful attraction. It was a new paradigm, proof that if you committed completely to a property, if you honored it rather than simply exploited it, if you gave fans not an approximation but the real thing, they would come in numbers that justified any expense, any effort. The arms race intensified. Disney acquired Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, amassing intellectual property that could be transformed into themed lands. Universal deepened its partnership with Nintendo, Comcast, with resources to match Disney, fought for every advantage, every edge. Technology advanced rapidly. Projection systems improved, becoming brighter, more realistic, able to create images that fooled the eye even in daylight. Animatronics incorporated more subtle movements, micro-expressions, breathing, blinking. The uncanny valley was being crossed. Figures that seemed genuinely alive rather than mechanical approximations. Star Wars: Galaxy's Edge opened at Disneyland in May of 2019 and at Disney's Hollywood Studios in August of the same year. It was Disney's answer to Harry Potter, a 14-acre land that recreated the planet Batuu, an outpost world on the edge of known space. Every cast member stayed in character. Every interaction was an opportunity for storytelling. The land was set during a specific time in the Star Wars timeline between episodes 8 and 9, and guests were meant to feel like they were living through events, not just observing them. The centerpiece attraction, Star Wars: Rise of the Resistance, was staggering in its ambition. Guests were recruited by the Resistance, captured by the First Order, taken aboard a Star Destroyer. The experience involved multiple ride systems, trackless vehicles, motion simulators, physical sets the size of warehouses, animatronics, projections, practical effects. It lasted nearly 20 minutes, and it told a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. The cost was rumored to exceed $1 billion for the land, but Disney had learned the lesson Universal taught with Harry Potter. If you build it right, if you commit completely, they will come, and they will keep coming year after year, bringing their children, their grandchildren, making it part of their family tradition. But something else was happening too, a shift in how these places were understood. They were no longer just amusement parks. They had become cultural institutions, pilgrimage sites, places people felt compelled to visit, not once but repeatedly, building traditions around annual trips, seasonal celebrations, special events. Disney created special ticketed events, Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween Party, Mickey's Very Merry Christmas Party, times when the parks closed early to regular guests and reopened for those who had purchased event tickets, offering special shows, unique character interactions, exclusive merchandise, and people paid premium prices. Not because they had to, but because these events became part of their family's yearly rhythm, markers of time's passage, anchors of memory. The parks had also become increasingly sophisticated in their data collection, their understanding of guest behavior. Magic bands at Disney World tracked every interaction, every purchase, every ride, creating detailed profiles that allowed for personalization, but also for optimization. They knew crowd patterns, could predict demand, adjust staffing, modify wait times. The parks were becoming smart, responsive, adaptive systems that could tune themselves in real time. European expansion brought new challenges. Disneyland Paris opened in April of 1992, and it struggled initially. European vacation patterns were different. Cultural attitudes toward American entertainment were complex. The weather was colder, rainier than Florida or California. Attendance lagged projections. The company lost money for years, but they persisted, refined the offering, added attractions, and gradually it found its audience, became profitable, became beloved. Shanghai Disneyland opened in June of 2016, Disney's first park in mainland China. It was built in partnership with the Chinese government, designed specifically for Chinese guests. Attractions featured Chinese language and cultural elements. The castle was the tallest Disney had ever built. The park incorporated feng shui principles in its design, and it succeeded, drawing millions of visitors, proving that the model could adapt, could respect local culture while maintaining its essential identity. But perhaps the most significant development of recent years came not from expansion, but from interruption. In March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic forced theme parks worldwide to close. Disney World, Disneyland, Universal, parks across the globe went dark, silent, empty for the first time since they had opened. The images were haunting: Main Street with no crowds, castles reflected in puddles with no one to see them, roller coasters still against empty skies. These places that had been built to hold tens of thousands stood vacant, waiting, and the world felt the absence, felt the loss more keenly than anyone might have predicted. When they reopened, months later, it was different. Capacity was limited, masks were required, social distancing markers appeared on queues, character interactions happened from a distance. The spontaneous moments of connection were mediated by precaution, and yet people came, grateful just to be back, to reclaim something that felt normal, that felt joyful in a time of considerable darkness. The pandemic had revealed something important. These places weren't frivolous, weren't merely commercial enterprises. They served a function in people's lives, psychological, emotional. They were places where memories were made deliberately, where families came together with shared purpose, where the ordinary strictures of life were temporarily suspended in favor of wonder, of play, of imagination made manifest. As the parks fully reopened, as capacity restrictions lifted, as masks came off and characters could once again embrace children, there was a sense of restoration, of something important being returned. The attendance numbers rebounded quickly, surpassing pre-pandemic levels, proving that the appetite for these experiences hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown, sharpened by absence into something closer to need. And now, in this current moment, the parks continue to evolve. Virtual queues replace physical lines at popular attractions. Mobile apps handle reservations and purchases. Augmented reality overlays digital elements onto physical spaces. creating hybrid experiences that blur the boundaries even further. Technology serves the story, serves the immersion, finding new ways to astonish, new methods of transport. The question that hangs in the air now, suspended like a thought half-formed, is what comes next. Where does this evolution lead? When everything that can be imagined can seemingly be built, when budgets reach into the billions, when technology can create any illusion, any sensation, what new threshold remains to be crossed? What new dream remains to be constructed in steel and stone and light? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what can be built next, but in what these places have always been building, beneath the attractions and the spectacle, beneath the merchandise and the carefully engineered emotions. They have been constructing something more subtle, more enduring, a shared language of memory, a vocabulary of wonder that spans generations. Consider the grandmother who takes her granddaughter to the same park she visited as a child. They walk down the same street, though it has been refreshed, maintained, subtly updated. The experience creates a bridge across time. The grandmother remembers herself young, her own wonder reflected now in the child's face, and the child, years from now, will bring her own daughter, her own granddaughter, creating a chain of memory that links past to future through the simple act of walking through a gate into a designed world. This is architecture of a peculiar kind. Buildings constructed not just in space but in time, designed to persist, to accumulate meaning with each visit, each generation. The park becomes a constant in an inconstant world. While everything else changes, careers shift, relationships evolve, technology transforms daily life beyond recognition, these places remain familiar, reliable, offering the same music, the same stories, the same comfort of predictable magic. The psychology is fascinating. Adults who visit these parks often report feeling something they describe as nostalgia, but it's more complex than simple longing for the past. It's a reconnection with a version of themselves that still exists, dormant beneath the responsibilities and disappointments of adulthood, the part that believed in magic, in possibility, in happy endings. Stepping through those gates gives permission to access that self again, temporarily, safely. And the parks know this. The Imagineers who design them understand they're not just creating entertainment, they're creating vessels for emotion, containers for memory. Every detail is calibrated to evoke, to suggest, to remind. The scent of vanilla on Main Street recalls childhood treats. The sound of a particular musical theme triggers associations built over decades of films and visits. The sight of a castle against the sunset activates something primal, something that responds to beauty and scale and the suggestion of stories. There is craft here that goes unnoticed. The way pathways narrow and widen to control crowd flow while creating moments of compression and release. The way forced perspective makes buildings seem taller, distances seem greater, creating a sense of epic scale within limited acreage. The way color is used, saturated hues in fantasy areas, muted tones in historical sections, each choice supporting the psychological impact of the environment. The seasonal transformations add another layer. Halloween brings pumpkins and fall colors, harvest themes that tap into ancient associations with that time of year. Christmas brings lights, thousands upon thousands of lights, transforming the parks into something even more fantastical. Winter wonderlands in places where winter never comes. The decorations change, but the underlying structure remains, teaching visitors that change and constancy can coexist. That transformation is possible within continuity. But there are shadows in this picture too, questions that deserve consideration. These places are expensive, increasingly so. A family vacation that once seemed accessible now requires significant planning, saving, sacrifice. There is a democratic ideal in amusement, the notion that joy should be available to all. But the reality is more complicated. Admission prices climb, hotel rates soar. The experience becomes stratified. Those who can afford extra services, skip the line passes, concierge experiences, have a fundamentally different visit than those who cannot. The labor practices warrant examination. The cast members who create the magic often struggle to afford living near the parks where they work. They commute long distances, work multiple jobs. The smile they offer is genuine, trained, professional, but behind it may be genuine stress, genuine struggle. The disconnect between the luxury product they help create and their own economic reality creates a tension that occasionally surfaces in labor disputes, in organizing efforts, in quiet resentments. The environmental impact, too. The massive amounts of energy required to run these operations, the water consumed in fountains and attractions, and landscaping in places where water is increasingly precious, the waste generated by millions of visitors, the carbon footprint of travel as families fly from across continents. These are not small concerns, and while companies invest in solar arrays, in sustainability initiatives, in recycling programs, the fundamental model, built on mass consumption and constant growth, presents challenges that technology alone may not solve. And yet, there is something that persists, something that resists easy cynicism. Watch a child meet their favorite character for the first time. See the recognition, the disbelief, the joy that overwhelms them. That's real. Watch a parent cry watching their child experience something they remember from their own childhood. That emotion is authentic, hard-earned, meaningful. These places deal in the currency of happiness. And while happiness can be manufactured, commodified, sold, it remains valuable, remains necessary. Humans need places set apart from ordinary life, need permission to play, to imagine, to believe, even temporarily, in magic, in goodness, in the triumph of heroes, and the possibility of happy endings. The parks serve as modern temples in a sense, secular sacred spaces where people come to perform rituals, to mark occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, the first visit, the 100th visit, each one a marker, a way of saying this moment matters, this experience is worth preserving, worth traveling for, worth the expense and the crowds and the Florida heat, and perhaps that's the deepest magic these places perform. Not the animatronics or the projection mapping or the perfectly timed fireworks, but the permission they grant, the social agreement they facilitate, that for the duration of your visit, you can believe, you can wonder, you can let go of irony and sophistication and simply feel, simply enjoy, simply be present in a moment designed entirely for your delight. The sun sets over the parks, as it has every evening since they opened, the sky painted in colors that seem brighter here, more saturated, whether that's an atmospheric effect or simply attention, simply the willingness to look up and notice. The lights come on, one by one, transforming the environments again. The daytime parks are beautiful, bright, inviting, but the nighttime parks are enchanted, mysterious, lit by warm glows that suggest lanterns from centuries past, by colored floods that paint castles in jewel tones, by tiny white lights strung through trees like captured stars. Music drifts from speakers hidden in foliage, in facades, creating soundscapes that shift as you walk. Adventure gives way to fantasy, gives way to tomorrow. Each transition smooth, almost subliminal. You don't notice the moment it changes, only that the atmosphere has shifted, adapted, guided you deeper into whatever story this particular land is telling. The crowds thin as closing time approaches. Families gather for one last attraction, one last treat. Children fight sleep, wanting to stay to see just one more thing. Parents negotiate, promise returns, future visits. The gates that opened this morning will close tonight, and tomorrow they will open again. The same but different, because different people will walk through, bringing their own expectations, their own dreams, their own capacity for wonder. Somewhere in the parks, a cast member is making magic for the last guests of the evening, staying in character though they're tired, though their feet hurt, though they've answered the same questions 100 times today. They smile, they engage, because they understand their role, understand that for this family, this might be the only visit, the only chance, and every interaction matters, carries weight, becomes part of someone's story. The maintenance crews will arrive soon, after the guests have left. They'll walk the paths with different eyes, looking for trash that needs collecting, light bulbs that need replacing, paint that needs touching up. They'll work through the night, these invisible custodians, ensuring that tomorrow's guests find everything perfect, find no evidence of wear, of use, of the thousands who walked these same paths today. This cycle has repeated for decades now, will repeat for decades to come. Each day a fresh beginning, each night a gentle ending. The parks exist in a kind of eternal present, always today, never yesterday, never tomorrow, just this moment, this visit, this experience unfolding in real time. And perhaps that's the final gift these places offer, presence in a world increasingly characterized by distraction, by fractured attention, by the constant pull of devices and notifications and demands. The parks create environments where presence is almost mandatory, where you must be here, now, physically moving through space, experiencing things that cannot be replicated on a screen, cannot be reduced to data, cannot be consumed any way other than being there, walking, looking, feeling. The castle stands against the darkening sky, solid, permanent. Though it was built to look like stone, it's steel and concrete, fiber-reinforced gypsum, modern materials pretending to be ancient, but the pretense is beautiful, meaningful. It suggests that dreams can be solid, that imagination can be structured, that the impossible can be built and touched and photographed and remembered. Fireworks begin, the evening show, explosions of light and color painting the sky, reflecting in water, in windows, in upturned faces, and for these minutes everyone stops, everyone looks up, sharing this moment. Strangers united in collective wonder, in appreciation of the beauty created solely for this purpose, to be beautiful, to inspire awe, to make people gasp and smile and reach for loved ones' hands. The show ends. The crowd applauds, begins to disperse, moving slowly toward exits, tired but happy, carrying bags full of souvenirs, heads full of memories, cameras full of images that will never quite capture what it felt like to be here, to experience this, to live inside the dream for a day. The park's empty. Grow quiet. The music softens, becomes background, becomes silence. The lights remain, keeping watch, waiting. Tomorrow they will fill again, with different faces, different stories, different dreams, but the same essential hope, the same desire for magic, for escape, for transformation, for the chance to step outside ordinary life and into something extraordinary, something built, something imagined, something real, and in the stillness, in the spaces between one day and the next, the parks rest, dreaming perhaps of all the dreams they've housed, all the joy they've witnessed, all the memories they've helped create, standing ready, always ready, to open their gates again, to welcome seekers of wonder, builders of memories, believers in magic, back into the worlds where imagination takes form, where stories become places, where dreams, for a little while, come true.